Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Abandoned His Hero Notebooks Forever? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Izuku Midoriya didn't know what to do. He was sitting in the middle of a desecrated street, watching heroes collect random scraps of slime from the slime villain, while others worked to put out the fires. He didn't know what to do. His mind felt strangely numb, while his body throbbed with pain. He couldn't look up. The heroes he so admired voices were ringing hollowly in his ears, berating him, snarling at him, calling him stupid and reckless. Kid, you could have been killed. Don't rush into a situation you clearly can't handle. Death Arms was yelling, face red and veins standing out. Izuku inhaled and resisted the urge to throw up. The air felt sticky and putrid against the slime still coating his throat, and he had to stifle the GG that tried to force its way out. Either the heroes didn't notice how pale and shaky he was, or they didn't care. It was incredibly reckless of you to just rush in like that, and downright suicidal given the fact that you're quirkless. Mount Lady was scowling. Her normally cheerful face was nearly murderous, and her pale brown hair was stained slightly gray in places from soot. Just looking into her violet eyes, Izuku could almost feel her anger, her frustration, could almost taste her train of thought that a quirkless boy had nearly ruined her career. Izuku could feel a helpless fury welling in his throat, tears springing to his eyes as he looked into the other heroes' eyes and came to the same realization. That none of them were angry at their own failures, they were angry that a kid with no quirk had interfered. Kaken was turning blue. He couldn't breathe. He would have died. And you guys weren't gonna do anything. The only reason Kaken hadn't died was because Izuku had managed to drag him out of the slime villain enough that his long-time nemesis had managed to wheeze in several huge gasps of air. Izuku sorely regretted saving his bully at this point. Kaken would most likely hate him more than ever now. He had hated him ever since he found out Izuku was quirkless, and well, Izuku couldn't change his mind. But what was he supposed to have done? Izuku had seen the desperation in those normally hot red eyes, the terror as his life was drained from him, and everyone just sat back and watched. Izuku knew all too well what that felt like. In elementary school, when they had gone to the zoo for a school field trip, Izuku had been pushed over the rails and into the sea lion pool. He could still remember the way his classmates had just laughed, and how none of them went to get their teacher. He would have drowned if not for the zookeeper that happened to be there at that moment. The man had fished him out, and Izuku had been rushed to the hospital for hypothermia and shock. So to see that same fear in someone else's eyes had been traumatic, terror-inducing, and before he knew what he was doing, he was racing out and throwing his backpack. The villain had been distracted just enough for Izuku to grasp and pull. It had been stupid. Izuku knew, putting his life on the line for a boy that made him feel close to death every day. All he had been able to think was, this isn't how I want him to die. Nobody deserved to die by suffocation. Nobody, not even the boy that had left a spiderweb-shaped burn scar on his leg from dragging him around the playground at the ripe age of 7. And now, after all this time, Izuku was the one being scolded. He could see the other heroes wildly praising Kaken behind the heroes, scolding Izuku, yelling at him, telling him how awesome his quirk was. How Kaken would make a real good hero one day with a quirk like that. And the despair that had been hovering around his heart since All Might had spoken those fateful words sunk in. It dug its claws in deep as he watched the kid that had told him repeatedly to kill himself be praised to the heavens. The same kid that had made Izuku so miserable and scared for his life every single day that he had contemplated just ending it many times. And now that same kid, that same bully, was being called perfect hero material. All because he had a flashy quirk, a quirk that had escalated the situation so badly that Kamui Woods had been unable to rescue Kaken. If it wasn't for his bully's explosions, the Wood hero would have been able to rip Kaken from the slime with ease. But Kaken had panicked, and even quirkless Izuku had managed to remain calm and nearly escape the villain's grasp earlier when he had been rescued by All Might. Hey brat, are you listening? It wasn't only yourself you put at risk. It was also our careers. Death Arms roared, and Izuku managed to drag his eyes back to the angry hero, examining his brutish face with a sort of dull energy. "We would have lost all our fans if we let a kid die in front of us." The man snarled. Izuku could feel something shattering at the words, something precious breaking in his heart, as he wondered how he had ever admired a man so full of himself. "I'm leaving," Izuku intoned slowly, his eyes dull and his heart heavy. "Have a nice life," he mumbled, and quickly shrugged off the oppressively large hand on his shoulder. Then without another thought he turned to walk away. Death arms spluttered behind him, but Mount Lady murmured that he should just let it go, that Izuku wasn't worth their time. Izuku slumped, dragging his feet. He was useless. He really was just a Deku, quirkless and useless and a huge burden on society. He couldn't be a hero. He couldn't do anything. He was a little surprised he wasn't crying. Normally Izuku was such a huge crier it was ridiculous. He cried at everything, at sad movies, funny moments, happy moments. Emotions of any large quantity never failed to bring him to tears. But this time there were no emotions. Just a hollow hole in his chest and a darkly truthful knowledge. He would never be a hero. He would never be anything. He wasn't sure how long he was walking when Kaken caught up to him. Izuku couldn't bring fear to the forefront even as the other boy grabbed his arm and ripped him around. He could see the rage and embarrassment burning clear as day in his eyes. Kaken always had a way of expressing his emotions to such a degree that even without the bullying Izuku could almost taste it. "Who do you think you are? Saving me?" he screamed. Spittle hit Izuku's face. "You're nothing. Just a quirkless Deku. You aren't better than me. You stupid weakling." His breath billowed over Izuku's face, and Izuku dipped his head submissively, waiting for the fearful tears to well up in his eyes, or for pain-filled tears as Kaken's hand let off a small explosion against his arm, bruising and burning the sensitive skin. But none came. He was so tired. So Izuku stood still, head bowed, and waited for the teen to work out his anger, impassive and tired. After a few seconds of rage-filled screaming, Kaken seemed satisfied and shoved him back hard, and began to storm off. Izuku watched his back, something welling from the exhaustion pooling in his chest, and he could feel words spilling from his mouth, but didn't really make sense of them. "I hope that, one day, you learn that your actions have consequences, and when you finally learn that, I hope you become a great hero," he called, smiling softly. "Goodbye, Kaken." Kaken stopped, his back visibly stiffened, and then he was wheeling around and shooting towards Izuku as fast as lightning. Izuku tried to step back, but the other boy slammed into him full force, tackling him to the ground, his hand held over Izuku's face, and small pops of light coming from it. "Don't ever talk back to me again, Deku," he hissed, and Izuku glared at him, his foggy head momentarily clearing as he hissed back, wiggling his arms out from under Kaken's legs. "Wow, what a hero you are," he spit. Kaken yelled, and Izuku barely managed to push his hand down before a loud explosion went off against his chest. Pain ripped from Izuku and he gasped, tears finally flooding his eyes. Kaken got off him slowly, then stared down at him with simmering red eyes. Worry and fury and satisfaction sparking in them. Then he snorted before storming off, and Izuku slowly curled onto his side. Tiny whimpers ripping from his mouth as he tugged at the ruined fabric of his shirt, revealing blistering, shredded skin beneath. It was the worst Kaken had done yet. But Izuku could manage. When Izuku got home, he had changed out of his ruined uniform. He kept another school uniform shirt in his backpack at all times so that his mother wouldn't know about the bullying. And quick first aid had stopped any bleeding. He didn't really get why, but something about the way his mother reacted to his pain made him feel uncomfortable and itchy, almost like something was curling under his skin in an unpleasant way. He hated the way she would reach for him, the desperation in her eyes as she asked, "Baby, what happened?" In that tearful voice, it made Izuku want to rip his skin off and get as far away from her as possible. It didn't matter anyways. Izuku had gotten first aid certified online and he had a burn kit in his room. He knew how to do extensive first aid, past what even the class had taught him, and even several types of stitches. He could piece himself back together, so there was no need for Inko Midoriya to know about her son's far too frequent injuries. The one on his belly was throbbing something awful, and he knew if he didn't want the scarring to be too bad, he had to go to his room and fix it now. But first he needed to see, if in spite of what she told him when he was little, that maybe his mom had believed in him. Just a little. Just enough. Enough to stop this helpless, empty feeling from swallowing him whole. From making him feel like the walls were caving in and the world was glaring down. From fully believing the words that had been beaten into him since he was 5. "Mom," he called softly, and even his voice should have been a red flag for his mother. It was dull and lifeless, strangely detached. But evidently this was one of Inko's less observant days, and she didn't pick up on that as she bounced into the room. "What is it, baby?" She smiled widely, and Izuku found himself watching her, his gaze a little too wide and a little too hopeful. He silently begged the tiny woman with his eyes to not let him down. Not how she had so many years ago. He could see her concern at his appearance, and hesitation clear as day. It sparked wildly in the depths of her eyes like a fluttering bird. But she kept that happy expression on her face. If Izuku wasn't so used to reading her expressions, he would have thought she didn't think anything was wrong. He inhaled, bracing himself to say the words that were dragging razor-sharp claws along his heart, and forcing them up and out of his mouth. "Mom, I can't be a hero. It's just like you said." He inhaled, the words clogging in his throat, and nearly choking him as he ground them out. "I'm quirkless and I don't stand a chance," he whispered, and his mom visibly straightened in surprise. Her mouth forming a tiny "oh," and her eyes growing wide. There were tears brimming in them, and Izuku waited, desperation pounding through his veins, to know what her response would be. Even though he could already see it, the quick emotions flashing past and molding together. Bright and colorful and thriving deep in her eyes. She sagged against the wall, loud sobs tearing from her, her body slumping. "Oh, thank God!" she cried, and Izuku felt his face go blank, looking away from her as he realized those were tears of relief. "I didn't know how to make you see it, that you just aren't suited for that life," his mom cried. Izuku stared at her. Just stared as she pulled herself together and gave him a wide, tearful, but relieved smile. "Thank God I have several other career paths you could take planned out for you if you want." She smiled, straightening up and moving to leave. "Let me go get the folders." "Actually, Mom," Izuku let a laugh fall from his mouth, wondering idly how she didn't notice how brittle and forced it was. "I think I'm just gonna go to bed?" He smiled, feeling like the expression had been carved onto his face. How could she not see? How could she not see how broken he felt? But as she turned to give him a concerned look, he could see that small light in her eyes. Practically read the train of thought. "He's hurt. Maybe I should comfort him?" No, this was necessary. He had to realize this. "I'll leave him be for tonight. We can talk tomorrow." He knew because he had been reading his mom's expressions since he was a baby. He could follow her thought process as if it was his own. He understood that she could see how much this hurt him, see how destroyed he was, and was choosing to ignore it. "Oh well, that's okay I guess. I have to turn in early tonight. I have a meeting early in the morning, so don't forget to make yourself something to eat." She smiled and Izuku gave her a pained nod. He waited for her to trot back to her room and the door to close before he was tearing towards his room. He slammed the door behind him, knowing his mom wouldn't bother him no matter what noises he made as he shakily unbuttoned his school shirt. He could hardly breathe. It felt like all his All Might posters were smiling condescendingly down at him. He could still hear his idol's rough voice say softly, "Sorry kid, it's just not possible. Not without a quirk." He started sniffling as he undid his hasty bandages, dragging his first aid backpack from under his bed and carefully pulling out what he would need. Gauze, disinfectant, antibiotics, a suture kit, burn cream, burn bandages so his burn wound on his arm could breathe and wouldn't fester. And quickly got to work. He stuffed a sock in his mouth as he worked on his stomach, muffling his whimpers and slight screams as he carefully worked to pull the ruined flesh back together, tears and snot streaming down his face. He chewed on his shirt and tried to inhale shallowly. It wasn't too deep, so no harm had befallen his organs. But he'd definitely have scarring. Looking at it, It was pretty much the same wound that he had had on his leg all those years ago. The second wound he didn't even need bandages for and was done in a matter of seconds. Using the last of his strength, he quickly and neatly packed up his medical supplies and pulled a random old t-shirt on, then proceeded to pass out. The sun hanging low in his window while the All Might posters smiled tauntingly down at him. When Izuku woke, it was quiet. It was quiet and dark, and the air hung heavy around him, like it was a living, breathing thing. There was a faint pain in his belly, but pain was as familiar to him as a cup of coffee in the morning. There was a prickling sensation under his skin, as if something was roiling and thrashing through his veins and pores, making his eyes burn and his breath short and choppy as he stared up at the ceiling from where he had fallen asleep on the floor. He could still hear All Might's words, ringing hauntingly in his ears and around his head. "I'm sorry, but without a quirk, you simply can't be a hero. It's not possible." He supposed he had to give the man props. It was the only time someone had ever apologized for telling him he was useless without a quirk. Izuku grit his teeth, that feeling in his veins tightening and thrashing like a wild beast. Every bit of merch, all of the posters, the figurines, his goddamn blankets. All of it was mocking him, smiling at him with the proof he couldn't deny. That the #1 hero in the world didn't believe he could do it. He could feel his hands shaking, gasping breaths of rage clawing up his throat and hissing out of his mouth, gradually turning into sobs. His body shook, and before he knew what was happening, he was moving. The rage blinding and all-consuming as he tore at the posters on his wall, ripped at the All Might figures, at his blankets and at his clothes. They were shredded as the adrenaline raced through him. Distantly he could tell he was scream-sobbing. That his hands were starting to bleed from burns from the cloth and the shards of glass. He picked up his All Might alarm clock, blearily registering the bright red 2 a.m. before he was smashing it down on the ground. Ignoring the way the bits of plastic stabbed painfully at his hands, he pounded it against the ground until it was little more than scrap. He continued to tear through his room until he could barely see or breathe through his sobs, until his hands were red and his blood dripped on the ground. He tore through his room, at one point ripping at the plaster on the wall where a younger him had drawn a stick figure All Might. He tore and raged and screamed, clawing at anything with All Might's colors, with any hero's colors, until his hands connected with a silky smooth notebook. He jolted, sobbing softly and pulling back. Held on this wall, on a simple brown wall shelf, was his notebook collection. He pulled one off at random, his hands leaving slightly bloody smears on it as he examined the cover. Hero Quirk Studies for the Future. Volume 12. Despair clogged up his mouth and he sunk to the ground, clutching the notebook to his chest as he sobbed. He had finished this notebook just last week. Had started to seriously consider becoming a hero and had started looking into heroes whose quirks really didn't give them powers. "I'm sorry." He bowed his head over the notebook, his tears and snot mixing with the blood now staining its perfect cover. A cover he had carefully designed one night after finishing his homework. "But we can't be a hero." He clutched it tightly to his chest and bowed his head as he felt something vital, something beautiful inside him, flicker, flicker, and then it was gone. And with it so was Izuku Midoriya. He wasn't entirely sure how he got up, how he drifted out of his room and to the kitchen the next morning. His mom was long gone. She had left a note for him on the fridge that simply read, "Hello baby. I'm sorry about your dream and about not helping you last night. But I figured you needed to work through those emotions alone. I love you. See you tonight, Mom Redheart." He stared at the note quietly. It felt like the final mistake in a global catastrophe. The one that made people realize, this is it. This is the end. That there truly was no hope left, nothing for them to cling to. That's what his world felt like. A bleak landscape of grays, blacks, and whites. Splashes of red dotted it every here and there, destroyed dreams and empty promises. Izuku's fingers gently traced the note, his eyes shadowed and downcast. He moved away from it and prepared for his day in a catatonic-like state. Gathering his school supplies, he moved through his destroyed room, barely noticing the mess. He wouldn't be going to school today. Izuku tilted his head back, his eyes locking on his analysis notebooks on the wall. Carefully, he took his destroyed Volume 13 and placed it on the shelf, then looked around. Volume 12 was still on the ground, smears of blood and slight water damage from his tears leaving splotches on the front. He picked it up delicately as if it was about to fall apart at the seams, and turning he went to place it on his shelf. But his feet wouldn't move, his arms wouldn't stretch. This notebook was unique in his collection. The others were just things he saw and registered. Hero fights he loved, analysis of random quirks on the street, vague presumptions and ideas. But not this one. This volume was serious to him. It was an in-depth analysis. He had worked hard and done some wild things to get this information, had used all his knowledge and skills to gather the right data to be able to study heroes like him. Heroes that basically fought quirkless. Like Eraserhead, Sir Night-Eye, Sirius, and several others. Their quirks didn't really help them with actual fighting. But they were still heroes. His hands shook. He couldn't put it up there, leave it in a room he knew he would never set foot in again. He couldn't just leave it here. With shaking hands he silently slipped it into his backpack. Then pulled on an older pair of shoes, not his red ones. They were too bright, and he had gotten them because they had matched an all-might shirt. He didn't look back as he left the room. Didn't so much as glance around as he walked out of his house. He would never see it again, and he was glad of that. Glad as he walked down the street he would never see this street again. That he would never hear Mrs. Tanaka's dog barking at him as he passed her yard again. He felt like something heavy that had been dragging him down had been carefully snipped away. Even the gaping emptiness was bearable. Knowing he wouldn't have to deal with it for much longer made his head spin with relief as his eyes closed. The warmth of the sun shined down on him in a strong burst, an average summer morning. Cars occasionally moved past him, but Izuku was too lost in his own head to really notice. He had a plan, a way to fix everything that was wrong, and he could follow it through. The world had made it very clear they didn't need him. That he was useless to them. It had beaten him down again and again and again until Izuku didn't have the strength to rebuild himself. He hesitated as he neared the turn on the road that would lead him to his middle school. His eyes drifting over the sign marking it and peering way down it to where he could almost make out its red roof. But he wouldn't be going to school today, and it was with that firm thought that he crossed the street, missing his turn, and continued on, heading downtown where he knew there were a lot of abandoned buildings. The area was so run down and old that heroes and cops alike hardly ever patrolled there. He would have space and time to orientate himself, to prepare himself, and maybe pray. Izuku didn't believe in a god. But maybe he could pray. He rounded another corner, one he knew was just out of sight of all surveillance cameras, and quickly opened his backpack, pulling out a different color hoodie as well as a different pair of shoes. He pulled the hoodie on over his backpack after changing his shoes and continued on. Eyes taking in the way the fences got cracked and dirtier. The way each building looked just a bit more rundown and ragged. How the lawns were no longer a perfect forest green but patchy and run over with weeds in several places. It was strangely soothing being surrounded by the mess and the junk. Having no one even glance twice his way the further downtown he went. He glanced up, his eyes locking on an old tall apartment complex. It was the tallest building in this area, and several stories taller than Izuku's middle school. He already could tell, just by looking at the old red bricks and smudged glass windows, that no one would question him entering, and he was right. He moved quickly but silently up the old wooden stairs, some of them creaking ominously, his eyes straining in the poor lighting. He passed several people on his way up, one of which was a drunk man that nearly staggered into Izuku and probably would have fallen if not for Izuku catching and steadying him. He had twin cat eyes and patted Izuku's head with one grubby hand, slurring out a thanks before continuing on. Izuku didn't let it slow him down as he made his way to the top floor, and then the exit that led to the ceiling. It wasn't surprising that it was unlocked, and he stepped out onto the roof without a second thought. The sun was further in the sky now, and it glared down with all the intensity of summer heat. But this high up there was a gentle breeze that tugged at Izuku's hoodie and helped push away the heat. He examined the roof dully. It had several air conditioning units and 2 chimney pipes. He could see graffiti every here and there, but it was old and peeling the marks of someone long gone. With a heavy sigh he moved to the back of the building, taking off his jacket and dropping his backpack. He slowly plodded his way over to the edge, looking way down at the pavement far below a broken alley far out of the public eye. No one would see him from this angle. He stood on the ledge, emotions writhing in his stomach and head, the hole in his chest gaping and yawning like some all-consuming malignant monster. All he had to do was jump, all he had to do was step off this ledge, and all his pain and misery and fear would be over. He wouldn't be attacked and harassed over something he had no control of anymore. He wouldn't be forced to hear again and again from all the people he was supposed to trust and look up to that his dream was unrealistic, stupid, childish. He wouldn't be a burden on his mother. Her relieved face flashed like lightning in front of his eyes. He had seen the metaphorical weight that lifted from her shoulders. There had been no concern for her hurt and broken son, just a relief that he was finally aiming towards something attainable. A memory flashed through his mind. He was 7 and his mom took him to a summer day care. He remembered her dropping him off and the teacher taking him back into the classroom and calling, "Okay kids, be very careful. Izuku is quirkless and he's a lot more fragile than you. Make sure you're careful when you play with him." The words had stung a 7-year-old Izuku to the core. He had had to resist the strong urge to flare up at his teacher, confused. What made him more fragile than the child that could only pull his eyes from his eye sockets? Those children had been anything but careful. What had followed had been the worst summer of Izuku's life. He had been harassed to the extreme and his teacher had never so much as blinked. She had tried to help at first, until she had heard Izuku chattering that he wanted to be a hero when he grew up. Then she had turned against him like the rest, telling him that it was, for the best, that he learned now just how hopeless his dream was. It took him a minute to register that he was shaking and crying as he stood on this ledge. That his heart was all but shattered in his. The fact of the matter was Izuku didn't understand the unnecessary cruelty that he had been dealt. He was genuinely baffled by the hate and the discrimination. By the way people would target him. All because he was quirkless and still wanted to help people. He was despised for wanting to save people. For wanting to do something, anything, for being quirkless fang Deku. And in a way they were right. What use had he been against the slime villain? It had nearly killed him and would have if not for All Might. He'd been nothing but a liability and that's all he would ever be. He should just disappear, just jump off this ledge and finally allow everyone he knew and loved to be free of him. He bent his knees, but remained locked in place. There was a lurching in his heart, in his belly, in that aching hole in his chest, tying him down and locking him right here. And god damn it, as his frame shook and his mind scrambled, he couldn't do it. It was the realization that Izuku couldn't even work up the nerve to properly kill himself that made him truly start crying. He sank down on that roof and sobbed, letting his legs dangle off the edge and putting his head in his hands as he cried. Why couldn't he just jump? Just end it all. He wanted this misery to be over. He hated this. He didn't want this pain. He didn't deserve this hatred. He only wanted to help people. It was all he had ever wanted. So why did nobody want to help him? Why did he have to be such a useless, worthless piece of garbage even now? A coward that couldn't even off himself properly. He was selfish and stupid. He should die just so he would stop worrying his mom and dragging Kaken down and acting as a solid weight or shackle on society as a whole. He shouldn't live. Is it really so bad? To want to live? The thought floated through his mind like a gentle breeze, and Izuku cried harshly, one hand covering his eyes and the other clutching tightly at his shirt, trying to force the hole in his heart to close. Was it his fault that he wanted to live? That he was scared of death? Everyone was scared of death. After all, Izuku knew that the only good thing he could ever do was die. So why was it so hard to do this? To do the only thing he knew he could do right? He sniffled, staring out over the city around him, his eyes swollen and face hot as he watched the sun climb higher in the sky and beat down on him like an unforgiving warrior. His mom would have received an email by now stating he wasn't at school, but one quick look at her phone and she'd see the tracking app on his phone claim that he was still at home. Because he had left his phone at home. She would assume he had just stayed home for the day, and she wouldn't truly freak out until she got him and saw his phone in the table, his destroyed room, but not him. Whatever happened, he knew he would never be going home again. He felt a little guilty over how this would affect her as he sat in a fog, but honestly he didn't care. He didn't have the energy to care about his mother right now. Not when her care for him was so superficial. She was just like everyone else, willing to ignore the abuse. He sat on that roof for hours. Sometimes he would get up and pace along the ledge, trying to convince himself to take that leap. Sometimes he would cry, sometimes he would sit numbly mind blank and chest empty. But as the sun began to slide lower and lower in the sky, Izuku could feel his chance slipping. He wasn't able to do it. To kill himself even though so many people would be relieved, happy that he was gone. He should find shelter for the night. If he didn't, he might wind up getting sick or dragged into one of the small gang fights that went down around here. With a slight sniffle, Izuku stood up, his eyes dark and shadowed. He looked like a completely different person from the person he was just yesterday morning. He turned and left the roof, right as the sun sank below the horizon. 3 months later, Izuku had to be careful and quiet, something he had gotten good at in the past few days. He walked silently down the alleyway, his head bowed even though he knew no cameras were here just in case. He was technically a runaway, and if the police found him they'd dump him back at home, which was the last thing Izuku wanted. He knew he would shatter if he went back to that place. That it would destroy him enough to where he'd shut down entirely. Every breath already felt hollow and the hole in his chest was gaping and empty, but at least he wasn't broken yet. Besides, it was surprisingly easy to avoid the police. He had learned from several homeless people living on the streets that they very rarely patrolled the downtown area, allowing the gangs to sort out their problems and keep the peace. Heroes only came here if some big-shot villain decided to hide out here, but they almost never did. And the ones that did were so smart nobody would ever find them. The whole district screamed of neglect and lack of care. Something about it grated on Izuku's nerves and stroked at a cold fire in him. Even as the environment made his muscles loose and the edge of the jagged hole in his chest soften, the sight of these torn streets and bedraggled people bringing with it a comforting feeling that was just as strange as it was welcome to Izuku. But still, the condition of the downtown district was abhorrent. The lack of care and regard for this place, because that's just how it is downtown. But he couldn't do much about it. He was too new to the neighborhood. If he tried to help anyone here, he'd be more likely to get shot or stabbed. So for the past few months Izuku had been living on the down low, content to just settle in and niche himself a place in this violence-ridden district. He was confident that if anybody from his old neighborhood saw him, they wouldn't recognize him. He had changed these past months. His hair was longer, tangled curls more black than green and hanging down around his face. He'd have to cut them soon cause they were more trouble than they were worth. An inconsistent food source combined with a constant need to climb and scale buildings to escape small fights and store owners who he had just nicked something from had made his form wraith thin, lined with lean muscles. He had lost a lot of his baby fat, giving his face a more angular sharp look to it, and even his eyes seemed a shade brighter than they used to. The forest green was more emerald now, hard and cold. The first week had been the hardest. He had been a bumbling idiot staggering through the streets, an easy target. He had gotten beaten up pretty bad, and eventually it was an old homeless man that had been leaving the district that took pity on him. He had allowed Izuku to take over his old home. It was nestled in the far southern part of the downtown district, the more abandoned part of the district where even the homeless people didn't go that much. Tucked away in a seamless maze of alleyways and hidden far off the main travel paths. It wasn't much really, but Izuku had fallen in love with it. It was one of those old industrial metal trash cans. It had been knocked over on its side so the opening faced out, and wasn't rusted or banged up enough for water to leak through on rainy days. It had plastic flaps that Izuku could prop up with 2 poles he had found to extend it out so that he had almost a patio-like area. When the rain got really bad or the wind, he could just shut the plastic flaps. In the dumpster was a nest of blankets, as well as a careful stockpile of medicine and food he had found and stolen. Another great thing about his little home was that since Izuku had become better at running and climbing, he knew if he was truly threatened he could easily scale the cracked and broken bricks of the buildings surrounding him. It appeared like a dead end, but to him it truly wasn't. And he was happy for this little skill he had discovered of his. Without it he definitely would have been beat to death 3 times over by now. He had become something of a problem to the stores on the other side of the district, stealing cans of food and pencils and notebooks from them, He had even managed to snatch a couple first aid supplies that he coveted. He had to use them to clean his stomach wound, terrified of it getting infected and relieved when it had healed nicely, leaving behind a rough spiderweb patch of marred flesh. But Izuku knew this couldn't last his little shelter. This district wasn't considered a hopeless case for no reason, and he was still new and unchallenged. Fresh meat. He knew some of the more violent homeless people were eyeing him, could sense their sharp gazes tracking him on the streets, and although he was normally able to lose them, it was only a matter of time until one of them tracked him down. And after careful consideration on his part, he had narrowed down to two responses to the situation before him: pack his sheet and run, or stand and fight for his little home. Izuku didn't know how to fight, had never learned, and the few skirmishes he had barely managed to escape from had proved that. But he didn't want to leave this place. He felt safe here in a way he never had at his own home, almost proud of his little shelter. He liked it. It was something he owned and he improved and built, something he had made entirely himself, and he was loath to give it up. It was his, and he needed to show everyone that he protected what was his. Izuku sighed, leaning back against the wall, his eyes flicking around the main street, a small trail that was heavily populated by the homeless community, observing and taking in everything around him. He wanted to stay and fight, but the clock was ticking down, and if he were to do this, he couldn't go in blind. He had learned a thing of two in the past few months. Had rapidly lost weight until he figured out sleight of hand and tricking people's eyes so that he could eat. How to be quiet and silent as a shadow. He knew how these streets operated. If he wanted to keep his home, he had to make it seem like the price of obtaining it wasn't worth it, which meant he needed to make a statement, his first of many in this grungy place. He wiped some dirt off his face and stared around. Observing and absorbing, he had already figured out that the most feared of the homeless community, the one that normally drove new people out, was a gaunt man in his early 20s with a quirk that allowed his limbs to turn into a muscular structure similar to a snake's body. Probably why he was simply known as Snake. Izuku had been tracking this man the same way he knew that Snake had sent his own goons. People had threatened and bribed to track Izuku down. Izuku was new and he was young, and that made him seem like an easy target. But Izuku would make this anything but easy for him. He knew where Snake slept, where he scavenged for food and supplies, what areas he had under his thumb, controlling those homeless communities through terror alone. Izuku marked those places on the map he had sketched in his notebook with stars. No one would interfere with their fight there. Izuku knew that Snake could crush a man to death in seconds when he got a hold of them. He also knew that Snake had injured his right leg in the past around the thigh area, and that for whatever reason the bone was weak on it, that the man would keep off that leg as much as possible, hence the weakened bone Izuku assumed. He knew that Snake was always weak after he used his arms to the extent that he needed to kill someone. That he was slower and his reflexes weren't as sharp. The energy and adrenaline evidently draining the man, his quirk making him slow. Izuku wrote all of this down in one of his notebook, his eyes shadowed and calculating as he watched the man from a safe distance. He needed ropes. He needed bricks, and he needed a blade, a big knife of some sort. As the plan formed, he forced down the rising sense of nausea that was steadily creeping into his belly. Hissing at himself. Don't you want to protect your home? He'll take it away from you and it's yours, and you protect what's yours. Izuku Midoriya. And Izuku did want to protect his home. He wanted that more than anything. So for now he locked up all those emotions he was feeling at his plan, the dismay, the nausea, the fear, the self-loathing. In the grand scheme of things, it didn't matter. It didn't matter how abhorrent what he was planning was, that it was something a hero would never do. Because Izuku was and would never be a hero, so why should he act like one? He shouldn't not when he was protecting his own. The rope he managed to get by trading a warm blanket with a nice homeless couple in the southern grid of the downtown area far out of Snake's eyes. He noticed they had a dog with them, and they cheerfully told him she had just given birth, and if he wanted in a month or so he could come take a puppy for some fresh meat. To which Izuku politely declined, although he knew that if his food sources started to dry up and he got hungry enough, he wouldn't hesitate. Hopefully he wouldn't get that desperate though. The bricks were also easy to gather. They literally littered the district, and by the end of the day his back hurt from how many he had collected and gathered in an old huge sheet he turned into a makeshift sack. The next morning he gathered his supplies and hauled them up to where he was setting his trap smack in the middle of the eastern part of the district that he knew Snake was hated and feared in. Nobody would even look at what he was gonna do here. They'd willfully ignore it actually. Izuku had watched them ignore a man get beat to death simply because he had been stealing cans of food. It was the final piece of his plan, the blade that brought him trouble. He knew from simple examination that none of the stores in the downtown area publicly had a blade that he could just lift that was capable of cutting through quirk-hardened flesh, and unfortunately he knew Snake's arms were hardened. Which meant Izuku had to be a lot more crafty than normal. He waited until daytime because here in the downtown district day was night and night was day, which meant if you wanted something dangerous done you did it when the lights were on. His target was a pawn shop that he knew some gangs bought and sold through. During the day their security was lax. All Izuku had to do was get in, and get out with a blade of some sort. One that was longer than a switchblade and stronger than a kitchen knife. He had observed their security systems and hoped that it was designed to register mostly quirks that would unlock the doors. Not a makeshift lockpick. A glasses repair kit could surprisingly easily pick a lot of locks Izuku had found. So he waited until he knew a customer was inside, keeping the only man there on duty busy. Then he slithered to the back alley, quiet, his footsteps lighthouse and careful, making almost no sound. Izuku silently worked on the lock of the back door, his fingers careful and nimble until a small clock greeted his ears, and then pulled it open but just enough not to trigger the alarm, which seemed to hog off at 7 inches, slipping his too thin body through the crack. He straightened when he was inside, walking normally through the racks of the storage room. He had found that hunched, careful steps drew more attention than normal ones. Izuku slowed down as he caught sight of some gloves and shoes with grips on them, designed no doubt for some hero that needed to climb walls but had probably been unsatisfied with them. They were dark black. The gloves had half the fingers cut off and he could see the hard bristling rifts on the palm like a cat tongue. If he were to slap or kick someone wearing these things it would tear the skin. Izuku hesitated, eyeing them, then shook his head. He wanted his presence here to not be that noticeable. Stealing obviously expensive shoes and gloves would just get him involved in gang affairs on the streets, and that was the last thing he wanted. The gangs disgusted him for the most part. They were often senselessly violent and harsh, causing pain and suffering and killing with seamlessly no coordination. Izuku couldn't stand them. They were basically unnamed villains. He moved quietly to the back wall where he could see weapons glimmering, and glanced over it, before smoothly taking a long knife off the wall. It was a bit shorter than Izuku's arm and was surprisingly heavy. He swished it experimentally, confident in the way it sliced through the air. With this, he could get his job done, and the metal gleamed a faint blue, hardened specially. He picked up the sheath and just as quickly as he entered the pawn shop he left, escaping without any trouble. After that it was a matter of setting his trap up and waiting, and just as predicted, Snake came right into his clutches, his arms lashing out at some homeless man that Izuku knew had somehow gotten on Snake's bad side, but the arms never connected, because Izuku was releasing the rope, and his bricks he had kept secured with it were falling, bound tightly together to form a weighted net. They slammed down on Snake's arms with crushing force. The man screamed so loudly that Izuku's ears hurt and anxiety prickled through him. The police didn't patrol that often, but this was near one of their patrol spots, and if they caught him he was sliding down an old drain pipe before he could even think. Stalking over towards Snake and ripping his hood back to reveal his thin face, eyes dark and murderous and pale lips tightened with fury. In the past Izuku would have probably been shaking and crying at the sight of Snake's crushed arms and pain-stricken face. He probably would have thrown up or run away calling for the police at the scent of blood and the bits of smashed bone and muscle. But that had been when Izuku was not Izuku but Deku, a useless quirkless cry-baby that couldn't defend himself for shit. Izuku was not Deku. He kept Deku's emotions tied up in a tight box in the back of his mind, forcing that horror and fear away and down until all he felt was a cold anger and a raging calm. Izuku crouched down, eyeing the man, and watched rage and pain as well as recognition flaring in his slanted yellow eyes. There was a tiny spark of anger there as well, but he was still too shocked and in too much pain to move. "You've been tailing me for a while now. I know you want my hideout, because it's safe and warm. I know a lot of you people want it. He raised his voice slightly at the last part and could sense people cowering away from him, terrified at his easy takedown of their tormentor. But I'm not giving it to you. Because it's mine and I protect my own. He blinked slowly, his face bland although his jaw ticked with rage as Snake sobbed and tried to snarl at him. You've been allowed to run around for too long, you know? Izuku sighed, eyes trailing sadly over the man as he started to try and wiggle away from Izuku. That wouldn't do. Cops don't care about this place, they don't have to. Heroes certainly don't, nothing in it for them. His lips curled and he stood again, slamming a foot down on Snake's bad leg hard enough to hear a loud crack. Another scream ripped from the man's throat, but he wasn't attempting to escape anymore. Izuku circled him, like a wolf, skin prickling, and that distant part of his mind that wasn't calm and in control writhed. I didn't have to do this. I just wanted to live peacefully, but you sent your men to snip at my heels. Somewhere inside him Deku was screaming, he could feel a little bit of that. Breaking into his calm facade, his eyes trying to well with tears and his stomach turning sickeningly as he looked at the broken man beneath him. He forced himself to keep talking, to bring that cold indifference up so that it would lick back into his voice. But I can't leave this here because someone will heal you, and you'll be too enraged to take this as a warning to stay away, and you'll come after me. Izuku blinked, slowly, a feeling of ice rapidly spreading through him. And I'll kill you. So I'm gonna stop that chain from commencing. He pulled his blade from its sheath, hand trembling faintly, it gleamed sickeningly in the corner of his eye. Snake was still whimpering and crying like a beaten dog, and Izuku could feel sweat building up and dripping down from his hairline as his stomach heaved, bile rising in the back of his throat. If he did this, he would never be a hero. His fingers tightened around the blade and his breath hitched slightly as he narrowed his eyes. If he did this, he would never be a hero. You'll never be one anyways. I figured I could protect myself and the people in this community from you. No one else is going to. We all know the heroes won't bother stepping foot in this place unless something's in it for them. He didn't know how his voice wasn't shaking even as his world began to crumble beneath his hands and words. It's not personal, I swear I actually really don't want to do this. Izuku heaved another exhausted sigh. He felt like a million weights were settling down on his frame, tiny fish hooks sink into his skin and tugging down, tearing his skin to shreds and preparing for something new and dark and cold to step into the world from his remains. Izuku breathed in slowly, the world slowed, and he moved. He wasn't familiar with a blade, but this move would follow through with its intent. It would get the job done in one clean slide. He had practiced it enough to know it could cut a brick in half without a hitch. It was a move that would cut Snake's arms clean off. His eyes didn't shut as his blade swung down, but his vision did tunnel, blacking out so he couldn't see the blade moving fast as lightning through the air, gleaming with the pale morning sunlight. He moved with the lean strength Izuku had built up in his arms and chest from scaling buildings and working hard these past few months. With the ferociousness he had learned was needed to survive. His arm jolted roughly, his blade coming to a stop, and Izuku flinched, eyes blank and unseeing as he waited for Snake to scream. He was definitely shaking now. Trembles ripping through his body as Deku's emotions and feelings broke from their confinement and rejoined him as a whole. Repulsion and disgust choking and clawing up his throat with the same intensity that the slime villain had tried to force himself down it months ago. The tremors only grew harder and more pronounced as he waited for the screaming, but the screams never came, and with a jolt he had realized there was a clang. Right when his blade stopped. His vision was swimming back into focus. The first thing he saw was his blade. It had been stopped a mere 3 inches from Snake's arms, which were turning blue and purple, and had blood on them. There was another blade under his knife, thinner and longer, another blade that had stopped his own. Snake was still sobbing and trying to squirm away like a worm on the ground, but Izuku had not finished his job. His vision was going in and out of focus, sharp pants tearing from his throat. Hands were gently prying his fingers off the blade. They were darker than his own and larger, calloused and worn, and Izuku's eyes slowly trailed to the owner as he worked through the layers of fog his mind was floundering in. A man was staring down at him, eyes dark and haunted, a red mask tied around his head, holding back thick tangled brown hair. Izuku could see 2 katanas strapped to his back and several small blades in sheaths on his chest. His jaw had a weird shape to it, suggesting a long tongue, and he had slits for a nose instead of an actual nose. He was frowning deeply at Izuku, and fast as lightning his hand fisted in Izuku's dirty hoodie as his other one slid Izuku's knife back into his belt. "He's not worth it, little hero," the man growled, voice harsh and grating, and Izuku jolted harshly at the tone and the words. "You're coming with me." He jerked Izuku forward hard with an iron grip, and before Izuku could protest or say anything, he was being roughly dragged off. As he stared in a daze back at Snake, now screaming and sobbing on the ground, his arms still trapped beneath shattered bricks, tears began to stream down Izuku's face, his feet staggering after the man almost willingly. And even he couldn't stop the sobs from tearing from his throat as relief sang through his bones, and he was shoved onto the back of a motorcycle. The man getting on as well and quickly speeding away. Somehow he knew in the depths of his soul that he had just been stopped from crossing a line he should never cross. He had just been saved from becoming a villain. Tsukachi had a headache. A huge, colossal headache that had started 3 months ago, when he had received a missing child case. The boy's mother had called frantic and near tears for her 13-year-old son. She had stated that something was wrong because Izuku Midoriya, who had just started his 2nd year at Aldra Middle School, hadn't been at school all day, and she had assumed he stayed home, but upon returning to their apartment had found his phone there and his room destroyed, but no Izuku Midoriya. The only thing missing had been his backpack, and a single notebook from his collection of notebooks. Normally a case like this would have been dismissed as a runaway. It was sad, but quirkless kids often ran away from home, either being abused for their quirkless status, or suffocated by their parents. Tsukachi had guessed it to be the latter in this case. So it was a little surprising when the case wasn't shuffled onto the list of children that were on the watch list, and instead his case had risen and fallen to his own hands. What had made it into a high-profile case assigned to him of all people was the notebooks. Scrawling pages of analysis on over half the current pro heroes, both working and retired. Detailed descriptions of their quirks and exact breakdowns of how they worked and how to help improve their fighting styles or how to kill the hero. In the wrong hands, those notebooks could potentially destroy several hero companies, let alone the boy that wrote them. He had called several underground heroes, but the trail was cold, which truly frightened Tsukachi because, runaway or not, if the boy was captured by the gangs or a villain organization, then he would be heavily exploited, and the thought of a child suffering under those people's verdict and possibly being manipulated or forced into becoming a villain himself frightened Tsukachi. All Might had only just gotten rid of All For One. He didn't want to be in the same decade that the next supervillain sprouted from, or have a hand in that growth. The only evidence he had was that the 12th volume of the boy's analysis journals was missing, the 13th volume was mangled and destroyed, the pages burnt and water damaged, and the grainy video feed of the boy walking down the street towards his school, turning on a corner that didn't have video footage, and disappearing. Tsukachi had had to go back to the Midoriya's home, and had looked around at the absolutely trashed room, heart in his throat as he observed the destroyed All Might merchandise, the slight smears of dry blood where some of the drywall had been torn off, the destroyed notebook, the last entry with All Might's signature scrawled across it, and had been only able to come to one conclusion. The boy had done this himself, had had a mental breakdown so severe that he had torn his room to shreds, until his hands were literally bleeding, and then left. There was no way his mother hadn't heard it, and she ignored it. But the woman had been very meek and quiet about that, not lying to Tsukachi but certainly holding back, and he could recognize a locked door when he saw one, so he turned to the next person to have seen the boy. He had called All Might and asked him, and his hero had stated calmly that he had only given the boy his autograph after saving him from a villain attack and that they talked for a minute. Tsukachi had inquired after what the conversation had been about, and his blood went cold upon his friend's answer. He had never been so disappointed in his friend before, so upset and enraged as he listened to the man weakly defend himself, stating that he just didn't want to watch a young kid die, didn't want to encourage a path that would kill the boy. Toshi. Tsukachi had inhaled, the pieces of the puzzle falling together. Toshi, how could you be such a hypocrite? His voice hadn't sounded angry, he'd been quiet and disappointed. And upon his friend's guilty silence he had breathed out. Toshi, you told a boy, a child, that he was basically worthless, something he's no doubt heard his entire life. I hope you haven't just created the next All for One, because people have become villains for less. And he had heard the quiet gasp of pain, known his words were a little harsh, that Toshinori had most likely only said that to the boy because a week ago he had fought a villain that had been collecting quirkless children and torturing them to death. But he was tired and upset, and his heart was bleeding for the boy whose room he was standing in, the remnants of a shattered dream, rage and pain inked across the wall in Izuku Midoriya's own blood. Tired and feeling beaten down, he had resumed his investigation. Digging deeper, he had uncovered that that same villain had attacked another boy a mere hour later. They went to the same middle school and had homeroom together, but according to records and Midoriya's teachers, the two never spoke to one another. And that Izuku Midoriya had been the only one to act on the scene. Watching the shaky video footage, he could tell that the other kid would have suffocated to death had Midoriya not intervened. And he had seen the kid being chewed out in the background while the reporters talked on screen. He wanted to scream in frustration. People killed for less than this. Why couldn't anyone see the crisis this child had fallen into, the sinkhole he had been stuck in, his eyes desperate and scrambling to drag himself out of his mess, but only finding himself buried more. He wished he had been there. All of this pointed to a runaway. The child had a mental breakdown, no doubt his final cracking point being whatever his mother had said to him when he came home, and he couldn't fathom staying here, so he left. But something in Tsukachi's gut told him a lot more was at work here. And then today, 3 months later, with no leads, a call from the higher-ups had told him the case was closed. Midoriya was found living with a relative, and Inko Midoriya had been informed, and that all was well. He hadn't trusted it for a second. Calling Inko after the woman had seemed detached, but she had completely agreed that it was all one huge misunderstanding, that he would be staying with his relatives for a few months and thank him so much for his help. His orders had dictated he closed the case. It was finished after all. Still, they needed to keep the kid safe because he had the intellect of a DMN genius capable of tearing apart their country, and they wanted him to drop it? Something wasn't right, something was very wrong here, and Tsukachi didn't know what, but he would figure it out. He just had to make a few calls, and while he tried to puzzle out Izuku Midoriya, he had to turn his attention elsewhere. He had at least 5 undercover agents stationed all throughout the downtown district, trying to worm their way into the gang's infrastructures, and one of his men had been close stationed as a homeless man under a thug named Snake's jurisdiction. Snake may just be a low-standing member in the gangs, but he was an in all the same. So imagine his surprise when his agent called and glumly told him Snake was dead from quirk shock and internal bleeding after having his arms crushed and his legs snapped clean in half. Tsukachi had demanded to know who killed him, and the guy grunted. Some kid he was underweight, looked like death itself. He didn't actually kill him though, it was the gang's healer that did that. I was there when it happened. This kid was probably 14 or 15. He was calm as ice and seemed almost detached from what he was doing. I'll send you a voice recording of what he said, 'cause it was creepy. The guy had cleared his throat. And what's even weirder was that the hero killer, Stain of all people, came and stopped the kid from continuing. Continuing? Stain. Tsukachi gaped, his voice rising in pitch. He was gonna cut off Snake's arms originally. But Stain stopped him, told him he was coming with him, and dragged him off. Jesus. If Stain had a protege, then they were seriously fed. The guy was an absolute monster when it came to fighting, and his quirk didn't give him any extra edge. Did you get a visual on the kid? He asked softly, and his agent gave a quiet hum. No, just saw his back. His hair was long, mostly black, but it looked like it could be a different color on the ends, maybe gray or green, too dirty to really tell. Unfortunately, he never looked at me, so I didn't see his face. He started shaking near the end of his little speech though. And when Stain dragged him off, I could have sworn he was crying. And with that, the phone call ended, and his phone pinged with a voice recording message. Tsukachi groaned, dropping his head in his hands after listening to it. He didn't get paid enough, truly. Izuku was silent when the man stopped his bike at an abandoned warehouse and instructed Izuku to follow him. He could feel his defenses rising as he stared at those long swords and the muscular body. But common sense told him that he wouldn't be able to run, that he'd probably have a knife buried in his back in mere seconds. So he reluctantly followed, heartbeat steadily rising and fear slowly crawling through his veins. He knew running was useless, but what could this man want with him? Nothing good. You didn't abduct a child for good reasons. At the same time, Izuku was homeless and had practically been erased from the world as far as the police and society knew. He was a blindingly easy target for someone looking to do bad things to a teenager or child. And there was nothing to make them hesitate. The consequences were all gone because Izuku had already taken care of them. They entered the warehouse and Izuku jolted as he heard an electric lock sliding into place behind him, trapping him here. He glanced back and then forward at the man's back, muscles tensing and stance widening slightly as he slowly crept along after the man. His mind was marching at 1,000 miles an hour. He looked at the huge room they were walking through. There was a small area with mats and weapons on stands surrounding it. Another cleared area had a punching bag and several of those weird things that would move to hit you back when you hit it. To the left, the walls were made entirely of glass, and Izuku frowned at the large pool on the other side of the room. On the far wall exactly opposite of him there were several doors leading off. The man walked quickly past all the training areas and Izuku crept after him nervously, feeling very much like one of those thin flea-ridden street dogs that snuck into the stores and gas stations to escape the rain. He had only been homeless and living on the streets for 3 months, but they had quickly become more familiar and comfortable to him than a nice gym such as this place. In fact, he was more comfortable downtown than he ever had been at the home he grew up in. Izuku was dirty, his hair was greasy and his clothes were tattered and smelled like death. He couldn't fathom what this man wanted from him. His hand subconsciously fell to the knife on his hip, palming the handle reassuringly. The man led him through the center door, which opened to a long hall. Several openings were off the hall and the man stopped, not moving further down the hall as he turned to face Izuku. Right now it's 10 in the morning. I expect you to be back out in the main area we just passed through by 12. Clean yourself up by then. His blood-red eyes flicked dismissively over Izuku, and he gestured to one of the openings down the hall. There's a clock in every room. At 12 I'll answer your questions. Then the man was moving easily past him. He opened the door they had just entered and closed it behind him, although this time Izuku heard no lock click into place, telling him he could leave these rooms, if he wanted. But he opted against it. He doubted he could seriously escape the man. Something about him just screamed that he was dangerous and deadly. Instead, Izuku crept further down the hall. Glancing around the corner of the first entryway, which was to his left, he blinked. It was a kitchen. Small, a little smaller than his old apartment he had lived in with his mom. It was simple and dull. Adequate counter space and a sink. 3 cabinets, a fridge and a microwave as well as a stove. He could see a small pantry door by the stove. Izuku didn't enter the kitchen, instead creeping a few more steps down the hall to peer in the next entryway on his right. This one had a simple living room, a standard gray couch and love seat as well as an old TV and DVD player. There were 2 empty shelves framing the TV, and a small digital clock over it. He could see in the far back corner that there was a small opening that led to what looked like a miniature laundry room. But he once again ignored all this in favor of going down the hall, and eventually stopping in front of the door to his right at the end. It was a plain-looking door, white and clean, a normal handle. Just a door. Sking in a nervous breath as he stretched forward, carefully opened it, peering inside. Then he blinked. It was a normal bedroom. There was an open closet and a dresser, a desk against the wall where a window had its curtains drawn open so the room overlooked the ocean, and with a jolt he realized they were near Dagoba Beach, the local, illegal, trash site. He had been there several times scavenging. He turned away from the window and continued examining the room. Izuku could see a normal full-sized bed pushed up against the wall. Soft blue blankets were layered invitingly over the mattress, and he could see clean white bed sheets under it. There was a bedside table beside it with a lamp and a small digital alarm clock that had the gleaming red time, 10:15 a.m., on it. Izuku could see another door across from him that opened to what was clearly the beginnings of a bathroom. He moved forward into the room, feeling like an intruder and like someone would see him and scream. The bathroom had a long white marble counter and a white toilet at the end of it. The toilet was next to a normal stand-up shower, no tub. The floor had changed from carpet to large tan tiles and there was a mirror over the sink. Izuku stared at his reflection in unabashed shock. He had of course looked at himself in puddles and such over the last 3 months. But none of those were clear enough to really show him what he looked like in XPLCT detail. The boy that stared out at him was a stranger from the boy he once knew. His round face and chubby cheeks were entirely gone. His eyes didn't look quite so wide in his face anymore. He tugged down his hoodie and just blinked. His face was a little longer, thinner than it had once been. His cheekbones stuck out sharply, giving him a haunted skeletal look, although he had no doubt if he was eating correctly the roundness would return with a vengeance. His skin was so pale his green freckles looked black against it, and his eyes were more shadowed, darker, and blinking lazily at the mirror. His hair was, honest to God, a mess. Long greasy curls that fell past his chin. They were so greasy and dirty that you couldn't see the green in his hair at all. Really, his hair just looked black, and Izuku nearly gagged. He had dirt smudged on his cheek. He looked disgusting and malnourished, and like he was not all there mentally. Izuku's shock mounted into horror, and he was a little, but not a lot, disturbed by the way this pale drawn face didn't move or form an expression with his rapidly changing emotions. He had learned quickly it was better not to show how you felt about things out on the street. Smile at the wrong time and you could wind up beaten half to death in an alleyway. That had happened in his first month out on the street, and shakily he reached up and pushed his hair out of his face, eyeing the red scar at his hairline over his left eye. But still, he hadn't seen how disturbing his blank facial expression was until he beheld it. Maybe it was for the best. He would be scared and shaky when someone snapped at him, but they would never know that he felt that way. He forced his lips into a frown and grimaced at how unnatural it looked. He needed to work on facial expressions then. It was for the best that he had trained his face not to reflect his emotions, but he couldn't very well walk around looking like a sociopath. He nodded at his reflection and forced his lips into a smile, nearly grimacing again. It looked more like a snarl than a smile. He definitely needed to work on this. Izuku wandered slowly back out of the bathroom and curiously opened one of the drawers in the dresser, surprised to find a single pair of gray sweatpants and a black t-shirt. Another open drawer revealed unopened packets of undergarments. The man's words suddenly rang through his head. "Clean yourself up." Oh, yeah, he was disgusting and hadn't taken a real bath in 3 months. Izuku glanced at the clock by his bed again, eyebrows furrowing. 10:20 a.m. It flashed back at him. He had been staring in the mirror and forcing facial expressions onto his face for 13 minutes. He carefully picked up the clean clothes, feeling like his dirty hands just touching them were defiling, and went back to the bathroom. Looking under the sink, he found neatly folded blue towels and some shampoo, as well as bar soap. He pulled out a towel and closed the cabinet, then hesitantly picked at the edge of his hoodie, frowning. He hadn't taken this thing off in a week, and the thought of being without it made his chest ache. He liked how big and encompassing it was. But still it was gross and smelled like sweat and vomit and blood. Maybe he could throw it in the washer and dryer he saw through the living room. He sighed and quickly tugged it over his head, dropping it behind him on the floor. Then unclasping his knife and its scabbard from around his waist. That really made him feel naked. It took him a minute to figure out how the shower worked. All showers with one handle for heat and cold ticked him off. But he couldn't help but sag under the steaming hot spray, looking down as his hair was rinse out the water, turning ever so slightly brown as it dribbled off his body. He took the bar soap and began to vigorously scrub at his skin. It burned slightly against nicks and cuts and the scaringas on his belly, but he didn't care. Watching in mild fascination as his skin turned into a more natural soft peach color and his scars were more visible. Izuku hadn't been this clean in months, and looking at his new scars in all their glory was strangely satisfying. He had learned from one homeless man that scars weren't necessarily a bad thing. They were reminders of past failures, yes, but also a map of someone's life. He blinked a little, remembering with a slightly fond smile that the strange man had been the one to teach him how to recognize how certain people got their scars. His dirty hands had tapped at Izuku's then bare belly and smiled before saying, "Some kid with an explosion quirk get ya? Somehow you look a little young to have been in the military." Izuku shuddered and stepped out of the shower, gathering up his dirty clothes and now dirty towel after pulling on the clean clothes, and firmly clasping his blade back around his waist. He wandered out of the room and back to the living room, then past it to what he had correctly assumed was the laundry room. It took him a hot minute to figure the machine out. He located instructions on the shelf over it where the laundry detergent was, but eventually his clothes were washing, leaving him barefoot in soft sweatpants and a soft t-shirt. His hair freshly cleaned, tickling his neck and shoulders. He raised up a strand and blinked at the way the curl turned from light green on the tips to a dark ivy green. He could only assume it was black at the roots. He didn't do much else, just awkwardly hovered for the next hour, unsure whether to sit or not, his eyes nervously locked on the little clock in the living room. His only reprieve was when he moved his clothes to the dryer from the washer, and then it was 12 p.m. and he knew he was supposed to be out. He put his shoes back on and hastily left the little apartment, wandering back out into the main training room where he could see the man with the mask standing in the ring-like section earlier. The man had no blades on him now, and his gaze flicked dismissively over Izuku's. That alone told Izuku not to try anything. "You said you'd answer my questions?" he demanded, and the man narrowed his eyes. "I'll answer one question," he responded, and Izuku bristled, his eyes flickering over the man. The man had an almost relaxed posture, standing the way someone who was in control and knew they were in control would stand. His eyes tracked Izuku's every move. "What do I need to do to get you to answer more?" he asked sharply, mince whirling around like a rocket. "You can cut me with that little knife, I might." The man blinked slowly, and Izuku silently cursed as he realized he had just asked his FANG question, which meant if he wanted more answers he had to cut him. He slid into the ring awkwardly and turned to face the man, again noting his posture of complete relaxation, his instincts screaming at him that no way could he beat this man. He only was good at situations where he could plan things out, not straight fights. He had the scars to prove it. But if there was one thing he needed, it was answers. He took a single step forward and instantly found himself pinned against the floor, breathing in the heady scent of rubber. He choked, and the man snorted, his grip tightening in Izuku's hair. He lifted his head up until Izuku was staring straight forward, his breath hissing in Izuku's ear. "Keep me in your sights at all times." He released his head harshly and slid off of Izuku, resuming his original position and calling out, "Try again." Izuku stood, his eyes narrowed and locked on the man, absorbing his stance and structure. He was muscular but lean, with long arms and legs and deft calloused hands. He could move in seconds, but Izuku knew from the way he carried himself it wasn't a quirk that enabled his movements. He took another step and found himself pinned once more. "You hesitate too much. You need to follow my movements. Don't trip over your own feet, little hero. Bracing yourself is good, but you're sinking your weight down, which makes you clumsy. Don't reach for a weapon when you can barely keep up in the first place." By the end of it, Izuku was shaking, panting heavily, sweat stinging his eyes as he glared across the ring at the man, unable to keep his emotions separate from his face any longer. The man tilted his head, eyes flickering over Izuku. "You think too much, have never had proper training on the right stances or how to hold yourself in a fight. Your reflexes are slow, although your eyesight is sharp and your muscles are more equipped to running than fighting. You didn't ask, but my name is Stain and I am going to train you. Training starts at 4:30 a.m. tomorrow and it is currently 7 p.m., which gives you enough time to eat and sleep." The man, Stain, straightened. He blinked slowly at Izuku, probably waiting for him to say something, but when the boy didn't, he moved on. "The apartment I showed you earlier is your space, and unless you ask me to or there is an emergency, I will not enter it. Thanks to your stunt with Snake, you can't leave the warehouse for at least a month while the gangs settle down, so for now you will be forced to stay here. I'll see you in the morning." Izuku was exhausted and sweaty and his whole body hurt from being thrown around, but his mind was buzzing with questions and confusion. "But I don't understand. Why are you training me? Why did you take me in? What's in this for you?" he demanded. Stain raised an eyebrow at him, expression dismissive. "Cut me tomorrow and you'll get your answers, little hero." 2 weeks. 2 weeks Izuku had been here, and he was growing increasingly aggravated. He didn't know who Stain was or what he wanted. He didn't know why he was training him. He didn't know what the man was training him for. He didn't even know why they were doing this type of training. Stain hadn't bothered to explain. In the morning of his first day here, the elder had simply explained what Izuku's schedule would look like. Every morning at 4:30 a.m. Izuku would cone out of his little apartment that he was steadfastly not trying to grow fond of, and would begin a light exercise and stretching routine. At 6 a.m. he would have his first of 3 small fights of the day with Stain. The man would stand unarmed in the ring, and Izuku would be allowed his stolen knife and he would try to cut the man. Of course, only to fail miserably. Usually the fighting ended around 700 am after several miserable defeats for Izuku, and depending on the day he would work on one thing. Each day of the week he would work on a different skill set. Stain had explained that Mondays were for defensive fighting and strategy lessons. Tuesdays were for offensive fighting training. He was to practice what he learned these 2 days for the rest of the week. Wednesdays was for resourcefulness. Anything can be a weapon if you know what you're doing. The man had growled. And survival lessons. Thursdays were for strength and core training, while Fridays were for agility and flexibility. Saturdays were currently free days, but Stain said as soon as Izuku cut him they would not be free days. Not at all. Sundays he was required to go through everything he had learned the week before and take extensive notes on where he was struggling, as well as analyze several hero fights and write how the fight could have been handled more efficiently or practically. All in all, Izuku was tired, a little overworked, and practically burning with the need to have his questions answered. It was what was driving him, dragging him forward and making him accept his rather harsh training without batting an eye. Besides, Izuku was smart, and while he didn't know why Stain was doing this, he had some theories. In his mind he had built up 2 theories. The first theory was that Stain was training him in order to recruit him or sell him to some organization, most likely a villainous one. Izuku wasn't blind to the fact that he was smart. Him and Kaken both were practically geniuses, he knew. The two of them found most school easy, and at first that had been what they bonded over. The fact that they as preschoolers were able to read at a 5th grade level and could easily finish 3rd grade math. But, while Bakugo had boasted that side of him for all to see, Izuku had shoved it far away and out of sight, finding it was far easier for a small quirkless kid to hide from the wrong eyes. He hadn't wanted a reason to be an even bigger target for his bullies. So somewhere in his childhood Izuku had decided to channel all that intelligence into figuring out heroes, why they fought, how they fought, what was effective and wasn't, and how exactly their quirk worked. He had written all of that down, and it hadn't occurred to him until after he left that his mother would call the police, and they would see his notes and would flip out. Because Izuku was positive people would pay him for that information. His first theory operated under the assumption that Stain was a neutral villain. No doubt his notes had been logged and put him on a lot of villains' radar. Stain had most likely picked him up with the intentions of training him so he could sell Izuku to some high-profile villain. The second theory was that Izuku was being groomed to become the perfect pupil. The perfect person trained to uphold whatever ideals and missions Stain himself wanted carried out. Of his theories, this was the most likely, and it made Izuku's stomachs twist with nerves. He was only 13, a considerably impressionable age Izuku knew. 13 was when the brain began to form true personality and logic patterns. Ones that would be very hard to unlearn. He knew that with the right training Stain could easily bend him. Already he had gotten under Izuku's skin. Wasn't Izuku training as hard and harshly as possible in order to earn answers from the man? Like some grade schooler desperate for praise from their teacher. But still, Izuku needed answers. He already didn't have much purpose anymore. Hell, he should have died 3.5 months ago. He was a little alarmed to realize he wouldn't mind allowing this man to twist him. He just wanted answers, and besides, if Stain did manage to get him to do what he wanted, it would be more than where Izuku originally was headed. Currently the boy was standing ankle-deep in water, heart in his throat and eyes wide as moons as he stared across the pool at his new teacher. Stain snorted, rolling his eyes. "You can't swim. That's a ridiculous weakness to have, in all honesty. What if you have to be on a boat at some point and it starts to sink?" The man demanded, and Izuku shrugged. "Yeah, but when a ship sinks it creates a whirlpool effect that makes it next to impossible to swim back to the surface." He argues and Stain glowered at him. You might fight someone with a water-based quirk one day, little hero. He rolled his eyes and Izuku scowled. As far as he was concerned, he'd be a mole for the rest of his life, constantly underground where no one could see him, eating the worms of society for sustenance. He opened his mouth to argue more, but before the words could leave his mouth, his new teacher suddenly moved, and the next thing he knew, he was floundering in deep water as he was unceremoniously tossed into the water. He screeched and thrashed, chlorinated water rushing up his nose and down his throat, stinging his eyes. He thrashed but in his panic couldn't distinguish up from down. His chest was slowly beginning to feel like a belt was being tightened on it as his lungs screamed for air. Just as his vision was beginning to get foggy, a firm hand clamped on the back of his neck and he was roughly dragged out of the water and sat on the edge of the pool. He wheezed and coughed out water, his stomach's turning, the coughing making him vomit up the water he had also swallowed. Eyes burning and throat aching, he turned to Stain, who still had a firm grip on his neck. The man looked entirely unimpressed. Try not to panic, I'll pull you out before you drown, and the faster you learn this the quicker we move on for the day. Izuku's heart sank slowly as without further ado he was thrown back into the water. The days were speeding by alarmingly fast, and Izuku had fallen into a routine that was as familiar to him as breathing at this point. He knew he was getting better. Hard muscles developing along his frame as well as minor scars from the more intense matches he had begun having with his sensei. After nearly 4 months, Stain's training had truly begun to sink in, and his teacher now had to make an actual effort not to let Izuku cut him. At the end of every task he would critique all the things Izuku did wrong, then praise the things he did right. And even though he had yet to cut the man, and therefore had none of his questions answered, Izuku had grown to genuinely trust Stain and even enjoy the man's quiet and intimidating presence. Sometimes in his own apartment he'd make an effort to practice mimicking that quiet aura the other emitted. Then he'd scowl at himself and blush furiously and rush to make himself dinner. But although none of Izuku's questions were answered, he felt like he knew Stain. The man was firm and harsh, but he wasn't unnecessarily cruel. He could be stubborn and push Izuku to his limits and beyond them. But he would never needlessly strike or hurt Izuku. Izuku got the impression that this was a man with high ideals and a certain set of morals, and he would not stray from those morals or compromise on them. Which Izuku couldn't help but admire. It had been 7 months in total since he had left home. 7 months, and the change had been drastic. Gone was the skinny 13-year-old who jumped at his own shadow. The image that greeted Izuku in the mirror was a far cry from his old self. He had grown a little. His eyes were more shadowed and cold, and his body was lined with hard muscles, making his shoulders broader and his scars stand out impressively. To add to the image, he had gotten a small scar on his cheek from a knife throwing lessons with Stain that made his cheeks look less round. His hair had been cut shorter than it used to be. Izuku found his water training easier when his hair was shaved low. He left it slightly long on top but would carefully shave down the sides and the back. A sudden pain ricocheted through his shoulder and he twisted automatically. One of his katanas flashing wildly out on instinct. There was a sharp ring of steel as Stain deflected. "Keep your mind in the present, little hero," his teacher barked. "If I was anyone else you wouldn't have an arm." Izuku cursed, twisting to go after his teacher. The two were locked together, all the form Stain had drilled into Izuku flickering through his brain like the flames of a wildflower, melting from thought into action in mere nanoseconds. Each move so memorized and rehearsed it felt like an extension of Izuku's soul, and he knew that Stain still was holding back for him. Today would be the day he was going to cut Stain. He would not accept defeat today. There was a feeling in his gut that told him soon his teacher was going to make their sparring sessions harder and reveal more of his own expertise to Izuku, which meant Izuku would be unable to cut him for another month at the least. He had to do it today. The boy narrowed his eyes, sweat dripping down his face, his tank top soaked through with it, his light tank top practically sticking to his chest. He could see the flash of approval in Stain's eyes. At the intensity of his strokes and the speed and accuracy of his movements. Through his focus, Izuku wasn't quite able to suppress the delight he felt at the fact that his teacher looked just as sweaty and concentrated as he was. The two were a whirlwind of blades. After his first month here, Stain had introduced Izuku to the art of fighting with dual katanas, and Izuku had taken to it like a duck to water. Stain lunged and Izuku fell back, a gasp tearing from him as his feet were knocked out from under him, his hand barely managing to draw his knife and throw it before his back slammed painfully into the mats and Stain's own sword was held at his throat. "You lost, little hero," Stain commented dryly, but Izuku grinned a wide grin up at his teacher that looked more like he was baring his teeth. "Did I, sensei?" He grinned, and Stain frowned, then blinked, eyes widening in slight surprise and hand reaching up. His left ear had a nick in it where the knife had grazed it when Izuku threw it. "I cut you," he crowed, and understanding flared in Stain's eyes, followed quickly by frustration. "You did it by sacrificing yourself," he snapped. Izuku glared, and opened his mouth to defend himself, but Stain shook his head. "It's time for the next phase of your training." He sighed and Izuku blinked. "The next phase? And I will allow you 2 questions. You may have the rest of the day off, go to your apartment and study or relax. At 6 tonight we can meet out here and eat together to discuss your future and your questions." Stain sighed, lifting his blade from Izuku's throat. The teen nodded, heart pounding frantically with delight as his mind scrambled for questions. "And lessons won't start until 7 tomorrow morning. I suspect we'll be talking for a while," Stain added, and relief flooded through Izuku. That meant that the man was planning on giving in-depth answers to his questions and not bullshitting Izuku. Honestly, Izuku didn't know what he would have done if that were the case. He had found that this new him that had been forged in his own broken dreams had a deep hunger for truth and knowledge and a heavy disdain for others that tried to manipulate him or intimidate him. He was only 13, but he knew already he could face most things and merely shrug before moving on. But Stain knew that too. He had realized Stain was much the same as him and knew Izuku would be furious with a wish-wash answer. "Yes, sensei," Izuku murmured and dipped his head. The two departed and Izuku all but bounced into his apartment. The second the door closed behind him, he removed his shoes and put them neatly on the stand by the door before padding barefoot into the living room. In the 4 months he had been here, the once dull room now had life to it. The gray couches had sporadically colored pillows on them, and there was a shelf of movies and decorations as well as 2 gaming systems. Along the back wall that blocked the living room from the laundry room was Izuku's new analysis notebook shelf already filled with 10 notebooks and a computer with its desk beneath it. He could see haphazardous graphs and plans cluttering the desk. Stain had made him start working even harder on his analysis, and now he had godforsaken time limits on how long it should take him to come up with them. Stain gave him a weekly allowance that was honestly a lot, so Izuku had plenty of money both saved up and being used. And with it he had bought writing supplies, clothes, a phone, and some furniture for his room as well as groceries, which he had to order online as he wasn't allowed to leave the training facility that often. He pulled out his phone, smiling as he pulled up Hina's phone number. The girl was the same age as him and apparently her family owned a cleaning business. She had a very powerful quirk that would completely clean anything she touched and get rid of all bacteria and things that weren't originally part of the object, which could be deadly if only she would let him explain how. She was planning on going to UA after their upcoming final middle school year. Izuku would say her upcoming school year, but disgustingly enough, in spite of himself actually not being in school, his sensei was forcing him to stay on top of his studies. Hina wanted to go to the management department and was planning on using the degree she earned there to register her parents' small cleaning company as one that could clean hero fight zones, as well as victim casualties. Something about that tickled Izuku's mind, and he had written a whole notebook's worth of analysis on what exactly a company like that could do. He didn't quite understand, but it was a glimmering, shining thread in his dark world, and he didn't mind twisting it to his own uses just a bit. Being friends with Hina was only one upside of his little mission. Izuku had met the bubbly girl almost a week into living here. She would come twice a week to clean the pool, having never hit a limit to her quirk besides hunger, saying that her family was indebted to Stains, and although he had given them plenty of chances to be paid for their work, they didn't mind and had vehemently argued against it. Stain had requested Hina to be the one to clean over here when Izuku moved in, and the two had become fast friends. "Izuku, guess what? Hina." "Izuku, I finally cut him. He's gonna answer some of my questions." There was no reply for a long second, and Izuku smirked, setting his phone on the coffee table as he saw the three dots that meant she was typing. No doubt it would explode with her disbelief in just a second, and he needed to start his dinner. He also wanted to put off explaining how he cut his sensei. Izuku didn't want to be scolded, as he knew he would be once she found out how he had beaten his mentor's challenge. It would not be the first time that Izuku had sacrificed himself to get to an end goal. Although he didn't see how it was considered sacrifice when he knew in good and well that there was no genuine threat of death. He would be more careful under the true gaze of death, he told himself. There was a small bounce to his step as he moved to his room, smiling slightly at the place. He had a dark forest-themed room now, all the furniture having been replaced with dark brown authentic wooden furniture and a green, brown, and tan bedspread with a singular whale plushie lying on it. A gift from Hina. Where his old room had been covered in all Might and Hero memorabilia, this room was coated in his advanced breakdowns of battle plans and ace antics that he had carefully studied and laid out. Just beside the window was a neat shelf, and on that shelf lay Izuku's hero analysis for the future books. All 13 of them. It had been an unwelcome surprise when Stain had dropped the box off, but the man had told Izuku they were something he needed to keep up with. The only one that was missing from the collection was Volume 12, the one with his analysis on underground heroes and heroes that essentially fought quirkless like him. Stain had said he hadn't found it among Izuku's stuff at the place he had stayed at when he was homeless, and Izuku knew that meant someone had picked it up. A thought that had been a little concerning before he realized that he didn't really care. The heroes in that book could easily look after themselves and were made of tough enough metal that Izuku's pointers and breakdowns would be something they could fight around and overcome. He shook himself from his reverie and stripped quickly out of his nasty sweaty clothes and tossed them into the dark brown laundry hamper by his door. He paused before heading to his bedroom, examining the shelf with his childhood analysis books coldly. He hated those books rambling about how he could be a hero. What a joke. He wasn't a hero and never would be. So, before you ask your 2 questions, I would like to go over the new changes to your training schedule. Stain announced, and Izuku tensed in his seat. They had eaten mostly in silence, and he was dying to get his questions out, but he knew the man would take things at his own pace. We are moving offensive training to Monday with defensive and strategy. Tuesdays you are required to rest until 12 at noon and then perform your flexibility stretches for 2 hours and a warm-up exercise. That night I will take you out to a quirk fighting ring where you can train against other people than me. The next day you are not required to be out here until you think you can handle it. The same thing goes for Saturday. Izuku knew his face looked blank, his eyes far too focused, but no twitch of his lips or twist of his brow to show his thoughts. But inside his mind was screaming. A fighting ring? That sounded so illegal. God, it sounded illegal. It couldn't be legal or right. No way there was a legal quirk fighting ring. No way. His heart was both pounding with fear and excitement at the thought of fighting against people willing to use their quirks against him. Stain never had used his quirk on him and probably never would. Izuku didn't have the slightest idea what his quirk was. Any objections? The man inquired calmly, and Izuku slowly shook his head no. None, sir. I, of course, would love some clarification later, but at the moment I really want my questions answered. He stayed calmly, and Stain's eyes glimmered. Ask away, he announced and leaned back, folding his arms. Izuku frowned, staring at him carefully. He had thought his questions over carefully and had barely managed to settle on just the 2 he had come up with. Why are you training me? He demanded. And Stain sighed, eyes closing as he inhaled. To prepare you for what you'll have to face, little hero. The industry won't be kind to a quirkless kid like you. I'm giving you the tools you need to not only survive but to change things. You're smart, almost damningly so, and with the right push in the right direction you could either destroy or fix this world. His eyes opened and Izuku felt frozen to his seat. His head hurt as he tried to piece the man's words together but fell flat. The man didn't mean what that sounded like. He couldn't. There was no way. Stain could see his struggle and gave him a crooked, almost sarcastic smile. I'm training you to be a hero, Midoriya, he said calmly, and Izuku's brain flatlined. His second question was gone, swiped clean from his mind. Instead, rage and confusion and indignation shelled up in his throat. I don't want to be a hero. He nearly spit out the words. I don't want anything to do with a system that does nothing but tell people that because of their quirk or lack thereof that they're useless and a disgrace to society. Hypocrites! He snarled, standing now, rage flowing off him in waves. Stain did not seem surprised at his outburst, his eyes slitted and a calm expression on his face, almost approving as he gazed at Izuku. But the boy was too enraged to notice. Standing there doing nothing, calling out to their fans and making light of their work as if it's something fun and cool. As if it's about popularity and fame and not putting your life on the line to help others, caring more about an image than a struggling child on the brink of death and having the audacity to scold the one that helped because he nearly died. I hate heroes and refuse to be one. His voice had never been this venomous and harsh, never snapped out like this. And for those reasons you will be one. Stain said evenly. I will make you into one. And he said it so calmly and steadily, as if there was no other alternative, that Izuku knew the man was right, that he had no say in this. He had known since he was 2, and no matter what he had been telling himself these past 7 months, at his heart and at his core, Izuku longed for change. He would do anything to make things better. This man was just telling him to do it in a way that wouldn't result in Izuku being on the top 5 most dangerous villains list. But why me? Izuku's voice cracked on that, pain searing through him, pain and bitterness at the path fate had set out for him and wouldn't let him escape from. Is that your second question? Stain asked curiously. Izuku nodded tersely. Because when I first saw you, a kid was drowning and dying, and while heroes stood and watched from the sidelines. Quirkless Izuku Midoriya tan out and managed to gain the drowning child just a few extra gasps of air, allowing the boy to hold on for just a second later. He blinked and Izuku was sinking back into his seat, curling down and away from the man as he saw the bright gleam of approval and pride in his mentor's eyes. The boy that tortured you every day, gave you so many scars, and you did not hesitate. You saw he needed help, and you acted. He was scared. Izuku choked. He was scared and he couldn't breathe. How could I leave him? He blinked up at his mentor and Stain just smiled slightly. Most would. He stated simply. But I saw you move and I thought to myself, this is a true hero. Izuku nodded and closed his eyes as Stain continued talking, inhaling shaky little breaths as the weak Deku that still lived inside of him tried to bring tears and sobs forth from his body. He would be a hero, it was imprinted in veins and blood. No matter what, he would always strive for change. 5 months later, Izuku's side was throbbing with pain. The crowd around them was roaring, but Izuku paid them and his side no mind, both a vague side thought in his world. His eyes were locked on the man across from him. The guy's body was covered in hard crystals, and Izuku felt almost disappointed that such a cool defensive quirk was being used so stupidly. He could feel warm blood trickling down his side from where the man's crystallized fists had torn through his shirt and skin. Through the fight, he had been able to figure out that the man was able to shift the concentration points of his crystals, and right now they were focused more on his hands than any other part of his body. He could have ended this fight long ago, but instead was opting to figure his quirk out more. The crystals aren't that tough, they're breakable, Izuku thought. He had already cleanly sliced off one of the crystals on the man's shoulder. The man hadn't noticed it, but Izuku's curiosity had cost him the wound in his side. He could already hear his sensei's harsh berating for allowing such a clumsy hit to land. He would already be in trouble for being here on a Thursday night without supervision. Add the fact that he was injured on the roster and Izuku would be in huge trouble. Over the speakers and the frenzied crowd, he could hear the announcer shouting, "And Mikumo has been struck." That's a shocker, folks. This is the first time in 2 months that Mikumo has gained a wound. Could Sumo be the one to take the kid down? And Izuku had to roll his eyes. Please, no way could a guy this slow and stupid would actually get him. It was his own curiosity that had enabled the man to land a hit. He wanted to make an entry in his newest quirk analysis journal, and therefore he needed more information. Only problem was this guy wasn't creative at all and was only bothering to use his quirk in its most basic function. which meant he had to get creative and investigate on his own. He was about to leave anyways. This was his third fight of the night and he had decided this should be his last. After all, he only had so many hours until Stain came back from whatever his nightly outings were. So calmly, he pulled his knives out of his sleeves. Instantly the crowd was dying down and the audience seemed to hold its breath. Izuku Midoriya didn't have a quirk. Izuku Midoriya was a quirkless, weak 13-year-old boy that had gone missing a year ago and was undoubtedly presumed dead. Izuku was not that boy when he stepped into this ring. He was Akitani Mikumo, a 14-year-old boy with a blade quirk that enabled him to handle anything with a sharp edge as if it was an extension of his own soul. A gifted boy whose mentor had decided that this would be a good place to develop his quirk and fighting skills further. The crowd knew that Mikumo would refrain from using his quirk that he rarely did to prove a point, to prove how weak his opponents were. But when he did, the fight was over in a blink of an eye. Taking out his knives was not a sign that you were good enough for Mikumo's acknowledgement. It meant Mikumo was bored and he wanted this over fast. He could see that knowledge light up the man's azure eyes the same color of his crystals. I would say it was nice fighting with you, but it wasn't. Izuku intoned, boredom lacing his every word. The crowd seemed to inhale, and before it could exhale, Izuku had the man down on his face and one knife pressed into his lower spine, easily slid between two crystals, the other pinned against his throat and rapidly cutting through the hard crystal as if they were made of butter. Yield. Izuku hissed. He disliked causing permanent damage to his opponents, but the fight must go on until his opponent couldn't move or they yielded. The crowd was roaring 3 times as loudly as they had before. Sumo struggled, but Izuku just tightened his grip, allowing his knife to slowly sink into the skin of the man's back. Yield before you lose your legs. Izuku snarled, and the man grunted in pain and slammed his hand onto the ground. The announcer called it, and Izuku stood up, rolling his shoulders. He kept Mikumo's bored face on and calmly marched out of the ring. Striding through the path towards the fighter's earnings booth and calmly signing off his winnings so they would go back to the club. The man behind the counter gave him an oily smile. Always a pleasure watching you work, Mikumo. He purred, and Izuku gave him a blank look devoid of emotion. Let me go to the back, Haru. He snapped, and the man raised his hands in acknowledgement. The fighters that donated half their winnings back to the club got private recuperating quarters in the back. Given that Mikumo never kept his earnings and gave it all to the dueling club, he had an almost apartment back there. A room with a kitchen that he kept full of medical supplies, and a bathroom with a shower and a toilet and sink. But as he was heading back, a hand wrapped tightly around his upper arm and he found himself being dragged in the opposite direction. The hand on his arm was bruising and had lifted him up enough that his feet were staggering slightly as he attempted to keep up. The only thing that kept him from attacking the person was the fact that he knew them. He'd recognized that too rough grip anywhere, and it never failed at making him bristle with indignation. Stupid if a beach but brat. Dabi snarled, dragging him away from Izuku's room and out to the back alley of the club. Izuku glared as the fire user shook him a bit. The F? Do you think you're doing here? Alone without your master on a training night? Dabi spit, and Izuku shoved his hand off with a snarl. Dabi hadn't reacted like this the last he had snuck out. They had bone and eaten burgers together. I was restless and wanted to fight. Couldn't sleep. He snapped, and Dabi hissed out smoke, rounding so he was right up in Izuku's face, blue eyes and scars glinting dangerously in the faint light from the street. He was broader and taller than Izuku, and suddenly Izuku felt very, very small. You want to fight, you call me you beach? You don't walk into a veritable lion's den FANG alone when you're already on people's hit list. Dabi spit. He shoved Izuku hard, and the boy yelped slightly as his back struck the bricks of the dueling club behind them. Whatever, I can handle myself. He snarled, and Dabi laughed. The two had met on Izuku's 3rd time here. Dabi had beat the sheet out of Izuku in the ring and burned him a bit. But Izuku had been fascinated by the savagery Dabi had shown and had purposefully sought him out both in and out of fights until he'd bothered him enough that Dabi agreed to be a sparring partner with him and teach Izuku how to handle more flashy quirks being thrown at him. Ever since then they had gradually become almost close, Dabi taking a personal look into Izuku's safety. Little Izuku thinks he can handle all the big bad wolves on his tail? Dabi cooed, voice dripping with condescension. Izuku spit, surging forward, but Dabi slammed him back against the wall and forced him down so that he was sitting on a crate, the other looking over him and keeping him pinned against the wall at the same time. The only thing keeping you from being dead is your master's reputation. He spat. It doesn't matter how well you can fight when they have much more people than you. Izuku snarled and leaned forward only to once again find himself slammed roughly back against the wall. This time the movement aggravated the wound from his fight and Izuku couldn't quite stop the tiny little gasp of pain that ripped from his mouth. Dabi scoffed quietly. Got yourself injured, huh? You and I both know that last grunt didn't have a dime on you, so why the F dash? He snarled, and Izuku held still, allowing the older man to furiously JRK his body to the side and tear the hole in his shirt even bigger, one hand letting out a steady stream of blue flames as he crouched to examine Izuku's wound. I dash. A pained whine tore through his throat as Dabi mercilessly poked at the torn flesh. Wanted to see in nuances in his quirk. A whimper cut him off, but he. Jesus Dabi, the F dash? He snarled, jerking wildly as hot flames licked at the wound, burning pain erupting from the spot. He struggled wildly but Dabi easily kept him pinned. I don't want to hear a word out of you, you little snot. He got you deep and I need to cauterize this sheet. Dabi spit and Izuku glared down at him, panting and pushing down the high-pitched screech that tried to explode from his throat as burning hot heat pressed against his wound. FF. Why you? He snarled. Dabi just cast Izuku a feral grin as he pulled some cloth from one of the many pockets in his jacket. You can try, but you're little on the small and young side to even attempt to handle me. He flashed his teeth and Izuku turned a furious shade of red. Oh my god, shut up. He aimed angrily into his hands, pure embarrassment scorching through him as Dabi cackled. The man patted his now bandaged side and stood, stretching and giving him a long look. Go straight back home, you brat. If you feel restless again, just FING call me. Jesus, you know I can give you a no-holds-barred beatdown. And don't make that face, you and I both know that's what you want. He shook his head and Izuku rolled his eyes, gritting his teeth as he stood, and rolling his shoulders. You're always shoving me around like an butt. And you're always snapping your teeth like a beach. Dabi taunted as he began to walk away. Careful or someone might make you one. He gave a mocking little bark. And Izuku snarled at his back, but didn't lunge forward like he wanted to. The pain in his side slowing him down. God, if only the man hadn't cauterized it. He blinked, suddenly a thought occurring to himself. Hey Dabi. He called and Dabi halted at the end of the alley, turning and raising an eyebrow. Dye your FNG hair again, your roots are starting to show. He smiled angelically and Dabi tensed, a sudden burst of rage shining in his eyes as he glared at Izuku, one hand reaching up to touch his pitch-black hair. It was barely noticeable but Izuku could see the faint red roots beneath it. F off, Mikumo. The older man spit, and then was gone. Izuku sighed. He knew the words were cruel and targeting all of the other man's insecurities and whatever past he had that he was hiding. Izuku didn't know what that was right now, but a tiny voice in his mind whispered that one day he would. He felt a little bad, but at the same time he had to make sure that Dabi didn't follow him to make sure he actually got home. He hadn't been able to attend the club last Tuesday. Stain had been annoyed at a new move involving his twin blades that Izuku was struggling with and had forced him to practice it non-stop all day. He was going stir-crazy after a week of just being home with only Hina for company, and that was every other day. He had been itching for a brawl, a real one, even though on some level he knew Dabi definitely was one of the only people capable of tearing him a new one at the club, that would make his whole body ache and burn. Not the measured training sessions he had with Stain. For the past 2 months his mentor had been randomly disappearing every night for about 7 hours at a time. He dressed up in the full outfit Izuku had first seen him in. Combat boots, bristling with blades and a red headband as well as a white mask. He looked dangerous, like a killer. Izuku had briefly worried over exactly what his mentor was doing, but only for the first week. He had just wanted to win a couple fights, then go to Dagoba Beach and sit at the water's edge. He had first found the beach on a jog, and had stopped to demand what the F? Of his mentor. Stain had sneered at the huge piles of rotten trash and explained how because of the currents the beach naturally washed up garbage on the shores, and the locals had taken advantage of that. Now it was little more than an illegal dump site, and as usual no one bothered to clean it because there was nothing in it for them. The beach had plagued Izuku for almost a week after that. He had been disgusted and horrified by the pollution and had fretted over it, looking up files on trash dump sites and recycling plants before he came to a decision. Unbeknownst to Stain, he had been carefully cleaning the place for the last 4 months. Using his extra money to rent a truck, it didn't matter that he didn't have a license. He knew how to drive, besides the place he rented from was sketchy as all hell and didn't care so long as he paid, and carefully sorting through all the trash when he took it to the recycling plant. It was a soothing little project, and each time a patch of new clean sand was revealed he couldn't quite contain the rush of joy he felt. Although sometimes he had buckets of sand he had to collect that had been soaked with oil or rotten things and thoroughly wash out, which was exhausting. On the plus side of that though, Stain had told him his strength was improving by leaps and bounds. Just a week ago he had finally cleared enough for him to actually see the horizon and had nearly cried at how beautiful the waves were. Until he had reminded himself that only stupid Dekus cried at such ridiculous shit and he wasn't a Deku anymore. He didn't want anyone knowing about his project, let alone Dabi. Dabi, who practically worshipped Stain and would do anything his mentor asked. Izuku wasn't a moron. He knew on some level the fire user was reporting his actions back to his mentor. Besides, if Stain knew, it would only increase his thought process that Izuku was a true hero. He tried not to dwell on that conversation from 5 months ago. When he did, he would find himself collapsed on the floor, tears streaming down his face as he clutched his chest, which hurt, and remembered that someone finally told him what he had always needed to hear. You can be a hero. Izuku snorted with a scowl, shoving down the emotions welling up in his throat and forcing his walk to be straight and confident but easy. The kind of walk that said he wasn't afraid to walk these dangerous streets alone, and he knew he could defend himself, but he wasn't looking for a fight. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a baseball hat. Placing it on his head and tilting the brim down just enough to where no one would recognize Mikumo outside of the club. It has happened once before, and he had had to tear some poor guy into shreds to make sure the guy knew to back the F off. He wanted to see his beach anyways. It was on the nicer side of town, which made its existence even more enraging. That meant heroes would see it every day and simply bypass it. He sighed. To get there he would have to walk through gang territory, and that would be the hardest part of this. Several times gangs had tried to recruit him, and only once a small group had tried to rob him. For a second his mind flashed back to Dabi. The man had seemed absolutely furious to see Izuku out, which was weird because normally he pretended not to care about Izuku and just used him as a punching bag. Although that facade had faded from the man's eyes one time when he had seen the burn scar on Izuku's leg from when he was 7. He had touched it softly, tracing the ruined flesh, and raised an eyebrow at Izuku. Izuku had been too mortified and enraged to really register the man's words, had simply ripped his leg from his grip and told him to F off. Nobody was able to enrage and coax emotions from Izuku quite as fast and easily as the man. Still, it was different tonight. Dabi had caught him at the club alone before and hadn't reacted that way. Had actually just taken him to get burgers at a joint that was most definitely breaking at least 10 health code regulations. While there they had psychoanalyzed Izuku's fights before going home. But he had wanted Izuku to go straight home this time. His stomach turned as his mind registered that that wasn't good. He needed to go home right now. Izuku turned on his heel, but there was a muffled bang, and a sharp pain burst through his shoulder. He staggered and looked down, seeing a tiny yellow syringe embedded into his shoulder. What? He choked, his vision felt foggy, and he took a staggering step as the words slurred together. FF-. He garbled out as ice spread through his veins and he collapsed, the world spinning and fading entirely. When Izuku woke he was tied to a chair. Naked except for his boxers. His head was pounding wildly and his mouth felt dry. He shook his head, groaning slightly. Eyes foggy as he blinked and tried to take in his surroundings. A simple concrete room with a drain in the middle of the floor and a light bulb overhead. He groaned slightly. This could not be happening. This absolutely could not be happening. He pulled at his restraints, studying them with a critical eye while his mind raced, rope tied around his wrists and chest but his legs were free. He started making a list of all the people he had fought and beat at the club in the last few months and cross-referencing those people with any gangs they belonged to, but all those gangs were small and they didn't have the kind of cash one needed to afford that Tranky had been shot with. He strained to look behind him and narrowed his eyes on the stairs he could see leading up out of this dingy basement behind him. Undoubtedly they had faced him away from the exit as an intimidation factor. He'd be unable to see who was coming down the stairs. His heart was pounding in his chest as his situation ran through his head. He had been captured and restrained by unknown men for an unknown reason. God damn it. He had never been in this much danger before, and for a second terror ripped through him and his breath quickened. Then he was shutting it down. Mindless terror was something only a weak Deku would feel. Like his mentor said, fear was good as long as you didn't let it overwhelm you. He wasn't a stupid Deku or Izuku Midoriya right now. These men had captured Mikumo and Mikumo did not give two single fs about them or their shitty goals. Mikumo didn't even care about being hurt. He only cared about when his next fight would be. Mikumo was not Izuku and he stared at the calculating boy with a dismissive gaze. Smarts would get them nowhere if they panicked. You're awake. The voice itself was soft and gentle. It had a breathy quality to it. Like the man using it couldn't gain the volume to make himself heard. He made no sound as he circled around Mikumo's chair, but Mikumo didn't care. Mikumo had a fighting quirk and was trained to sense movements like this. When the man stopped in front of Mikumo, he blinked slowly up at him, taking in his appearance. Everything about this man screamed, "Don't look at me." His hair was a washy brown, his skin pale and almost seemed to absorb the light around him. His eyes were a pale watery green and his lips thin, cheekbones soft and sloping, giving his face almost no recognizable features. Paired with his voice and the fact that he made no sound when he moved or spoke, and Izuku couldn't help but think he had some type of stealth quirk, one that devoted attention and sound itself from him. Mikumo did not care about this man's quirk, but Mikumo did care about what the man was holding. "Hello, Izuku Midoriya," the man murmured, and Mikumo gave him a lazy expression, relaxing into his chair. Mikumo was the mask Izuku wore to hide the panicked thoughts striking through his head. "Or do you prefer Mikumo Akatani?" Mikumo gave no reply, his eyes barely flickering down to coldly look at the folder and the notebook the man had clutched in his hands. "Izuku it is then." The man snarled softly and Izuku wanted to snarl in rage, but Mikumo just leaned back in his chair, flexing his stiff wrists in their restraints. "You caused quite the uproar 9 months ago. You attacked the one man holding together the homeless district and keeping it secure under our control, and caused him injuries so grievous he died within a fortnight." At this, Mikumo raised a signal eyebrow. "Your incompetent healer is my fault? Seems like you should have gotten a better doctor." He shrugged. The man just chuckled slightly. "Right you are, and she was swiftly dealt with for her incompetence. You became a very low priority on the Yakuza's radar." At the name, Izuku's heart dropped fast, and it dropped hard. The Yakuza were made up of old mafias and gangs and considered harmless in today's society, but anyone that lived on the wrong side of town knew they were still very much in charge. There were 3 branches in total. One handled the district itself and controlled the gangs and distribution of their products as well as the clubs. Another controlled the flow of drags and traffickers in and out of Japan, and the third focused on developing new drags and weaponry. If Izuku had known Snake was tied up with these guys, he never would have set foot near him. But the fact remains that because of your actions, the entire homeless district has been thrown into disarray. It's taken all this time to set it straight once more. Izuku's heart was racing with fear and horror, but Mikumo gave the man a disdainful look. "That's what you get for putting an entire district in the hands of a degenerate. I would have thought you'd be more organized," he intoned dully. For a brief second he saw rage flicker through the man's eyes in front of him, but it was gone just as quickly as it came. "Right you are, but there has been a recent change of leadership. Unstable mafias were never a good thing to get caught up in. And he was willing to put you to the side when he found out who is currently protecting you. But then we found this." The man smiled and Izuku blinked with shock as he finally recognized what notebook that was. The title glinted mockingly at him. "Hero Quirk Studies for the Future." Volume 12-inch. An idiotic notebook written by a child in the 6th grade? Izuku forced out the incredulous laugh, pleased at the way none of his fear was showing. Yes. With this notebook we were able to infiltrate several previously untouchable agencies and collect all the information they had on us as well as tampering with said information. The man smiled and Izuku's heart froze in shock. There was no way. He hadn't written enough to tell someone how to do that. There was no way they were able to figure out how to break into hero companies based on how he analyzed the heroes no FING way. So, the boss has a proposition for you. You keep writing your neat little analytics for us, and we won't kill you. At this Mikumo slid back into place, rolling his eyes and sighing heavily. Sorry, but I'm not interested in being put under the direct orders of a moron who doesn't even know how to read the title of a notebook. The man gave him a baffled look and Mikumo raised an eyebrow. I could be wrong, but doesn't that say Hero Quirk Studies for the Future Volume 12? He smiled the most condescending smile he could form. What in your tiny mind makes you think something as simple as threatening my life would make me abandon my dream? He smiled. Don't forget that we also know your family. The man snarled and Mikumo shrugged. My mother barely remembers me and my own memories of her aren't so found, so please, be my guest. He smiled pleasantly. You'll rot in hell before I do anything for you guys. The man shook his head with a tired sigh. We had hoped that you could be reasoned with, but clearly that was a naive hope at best. Takami. He called lightly, eyes flickering over Izuku's shoulder. Izuku blinked and turned, barely catching sight of a guy standing beside him raising his hand before something in his arm tightened. A pained gasp tore from him as the pressure built and built until with an agonizing snap, the bone in his arms shattered. Maybe you'll be more willing to talk in an hour. The man in front of him blinked and silently, and Izuku was unable to hold back a scream as one of the bones in his hand shattered. You know that kid you were obsessed with a couple months back? The voice on the line was scratchy and muffled. The reception was bad, but Tsukachi was on high alert the second the words registered in his brain. Izuku Midoriya? He demanded sharply, and the voice hummed a confirmation. It had become common knowledge in his squad that the case bothered him, and he had thought something was fishy about it. He's on the Yakuza's list. The voice, which belonged to one of his best detectives, Sakura Ritsu, a current mole they had managed to wiggle into the Yakuza, announced. That missing notebook from his collection? Somehow they found it. Sheet. Tsukachi cursed. Several pieces of the puzzle in front of him clicked into place. The random attacks on several underground hero companies suddenly made a lot more sense. How they knew how to infiltrate the agencies that nobody was supposed to know about and how to distract the heroes with hard battles. This was FING bad. This was the exact scenario he had feared. How did they even? I thought the kid ran to a relative's home. How did they find that book? He demanded sharply. Sakura sighed deeply. Listen, something is seriously messed up here, sir, 'cause they found that notebook at the site of the place that homeless kid that nearly cut Snake's arms off was living. You know, the one that threw the homeless district into disarray and made it impossible to infiltrate the gangs in that district. She demanded, and Tsukachi gave a brief hum of confirmation as he pulled up the file. A scrawny teenage boy they had only been able to see from the back, whose hair looked black but could be another color. Well, I was put on the team to track that kid down. Of course I was planning on turning him in, but that's besides the point. The point is that this kid is popular in the underground dueling club Nightlock. She goes, they're under the name Akatani Mikumo and is registered as having a quirk that enables him to fight with any blade. He's almost a celebrity there, known for his ridiculous skill with knives and blades, but also for the fact that he fights without using his quirk. Apparently even the owners like him, cause he always gives his earnings back to the club, which is a lot. He normally wins up to 7 fights a night, which puts his earnings in the thousands. She sighed and Tsukachi blinked in shock. Nightlock was impenetrable. They had only just started getting info on the place, and the fact that that was even possible was all because of Sakura and her position in the Yakuza. It was where most underground deals went on and where most villains learned to fight. The place was dangerous, and a veritable black hole of intelligence, and this 14-year-old kid somehow managed to become, according to Sakura, familiar with the owners. Tsukachi doubted the kid knew he knew the owners, but still. He pulled up the records for Izuku Midoriya and frowned at them. It had been a little over a year since the boy was first put on his radar, and besides the records showing he was now living with a relative and not his mother and being homeschooled, nothing was off about his file. And what Sakura was telling him? Over the past few months, Tsukachi had almost managed to convince himself he had imagined the crazy factor to Izuku's case, tried to force himself to believe that the only reason they hadn't moved the kid into protective custody was because he had signed some kind of voucher or something agreeing to stop his notes. You're telling me this for a reason. You wouldn't waste one of your calls if it wasn't important. Tsukachi breathed and Sakura in a breath. They caught him, sir. He's being held in a different building, I don't know which of the 7. But I am monitoring the feed of the room they're keeping him in. Sir, he's in some deep shit, he needs help. She hesitated before saying softly. He doesn't seem anywhere close to talking, but if we don't get him out in time he'll have permanent damage in his hands and arm. Irika and Kairo are interrogating him. Tsukachi's heart clenched. Do you have any idea where he might be? He demanded sharply, already standing. Vaguely, there's 7 hot spots he could be, but know that I'm gonna have to back out for this, and we'll lose our lead on overhaul for at least a year or 2. She said softly, and for a second Tsukachi hesitated in shock. Detective Sakura, that is a child being tortured. He said sharply. There's always children being tortured. Sakura replied evenly. Well, not this one and not today. He spat, and wrote down the addresses she listed off. Get out of there, detective. He snapped and then hung up. They had a kid to help. He'd need several heroes for this night. No, the man would be furious at him for dropping the overhaul lead. Maybe Eraserhead, he was very good at stealth and quick but brutal strike downs. Yes, he'd call him, and maybe Fatgum. The man had a new intern and would love this opportunity. Rocklock was new, but he showed lots of promise. And maybe Kamui Woods? In the end, Tsukachi only called 3 pro heroes, and then he stood. It was time for him to meet Izuku Midoriya. Mikumo's world was awash with pain. His hands were limp and useless even as he stared up at the man in front of him. Mikumo was in pain, letting out tight little screams and sarcastic comments in between. But Izuku was thinking, pushing himself far away from this situation. This was a new quirk he could analyze. Inside him, Deku howled and screamed with pain and terror, wanting to cower and before, but Izuku ignored him. He had named this man's quirk Pressurizer. As far as he could tell, the man had a sight-based quirk that enabled him to build pressure in something until it eventually burst. An interesting quirk, very versatile. Once again, Izuku was a little upset that it wasn't being used to its fullest potential. As if from a distance, he was aware of blood dribbling from Mikumo's mouth as yet another one of his teeth was pressurized. His hands lay bloody and limp in their restraints, his arms a furious, angry red and swollen. He could see the bits of bone poking through the skin and destroying his muscles. What's your quirk called? He slurred, blood mixed with a thick saliva drooling from his mouth. The man didn't reply, and Izuku gagged as another molar was destroyed in his mouth. That was 4 molars now. His tongue played with the little shards and allowed them to fall out of his mouth with the drool and blood. He had to look disgusting. But it was good neither Mikumo or Izuku cared about that. I named it, called it Pressurizer. Izuku grinned a bloody gaping grin, and the man looked mildly disturbed. Stepping back slightly. Oh, was I right? Izuku's words came out garbled but clearly understandable. I thought you could pressurize anything, he mused, blood dribbling down. He ignored it. That was Mikumo's pain, not his. Izuku didn't feel pain. But you'd have destroyed something other than my bones at this point, so I'm guessing it only works on bones, huh? The F-. The man hissed softly, his yellow eyes were wide and he looked mildly terrified. This isn't affecting you at all? He demanded, and Izuku shrugged elaborately. Mikumo feels pain. The man stepped slightly closer with a confused look. I'm not Mikumo. Izuku snarled, his legs snapped forward and wrapped around the man's waist, jerking him forward as he surged up against his restraints and bit. His eye-damaged teeth sunk into soft skin and the man above him screamed. He could feel several bone in his ribcage shatter, but he didn't care as he sunk his teeth deep into the man's throat and ripped. The man spasmed against him, gurgling as blood poured into the hole Izuku had torn in his throat. and Izuku gagged as pain slammed through his body. Mikumo couldn't handle that pain. He spit out the chunk of bloody flesh in his mouth, vomit rushing up from his throat and spewing from his mouth. As soon as he was done heaving, his mouth was on fire, the stomach acid burning the cuts from his shattered teeth and the holes where they had once been. He blinked the tears from his eyes, a small voice reminding him that only stupid Dekus cried. Carefully he wiggles the man's body up his own until he could work a knife from his pants. He lifted the knife to his hand with his foot and then jolted. He couldn't move his hand. His hand was destroyed, dark purple, and swollen with torn flesh and shards of bone sticking through the skin. He let out a small scream of rage, shaking all over and violently struggling. How was he supposed to cut this rope if he couldn't move his hands? He thrashed and screeched as pain tore through his hands. And it was at that second that door slammed open loudly behind. He started struggling even more frantically, snarling furiously as more blood flooded his mouth and splattered out with every breath. Mikumo! Mikumo, hold still! The voice was sharp and rough and so familiar Izuku could cry. Dabi was crouched in front of him, dragging the body off of Izuku's lap and grabbing the knife he had dropped in his panic to cut through Izuku's restraints. Dabi! Izuku slurred, more blood dribbling from his mouth. The man's eyes were dark with fury and neon blue flames were sparking along his hands. Stain sent me to get you. He's waiting with the getaway vehicle. Couldn't come himself. Cops are about to get here. We gotta hurry. Can you walk? He rushed out and Izuku nodded, staggering to his feet, his hands hanging limply. Sheet your hands, Dabi chokes, and Izuku shook his head. Don't thin, bout it. He opened his mouth to spit the blood out, but it wasn't responding right and just dribbled out and down his chin. Jesus, I told you to go home, you beach. Dabi sounded pained and his eyes were wide and full of terror and worry, and Izuku barely managed to coo through the pain. Aw, you do care. F off. Dabi snarled and turned, heading up the stairs and gesturing urgently at Izuku to follow him. Izuku did so, trying to ignore the dizzy feeling rushing through him as he followed the man through the halls. He read the signs on each corner as they went and paused on one. Computer rooms, it read. Dabi's this way. He slurred and stalked off. Dabi cursed behind him. Effing hell, Izuku, no. He snarled, but Izuku had already slipped into a door. He looked around the room and clumsily made his way to the computers. What are you doing? You don't have any effing hands? Dabi spat behind him. Have your hands. Izuku blinked slowly and Dabi bit his lip before whispering. Tell me what you're doing. Camera's down, but that one is still working. He gestured, tilted his head to the corner, and Dabi swore, turning his face from it. Done? Worry eyes, police cam, watching. He intoned. Dabi made a choking noise. I'm not having career ruined for self-defense reasons. Izuku choked, coughing out blood from his throat. Dabi winced, but after a second he nodded. Okay, please just be quick. In the end, Dabi ended up having to carry Izuku. He wrapped the small teen in his coat and carried him on his back, Izuku murmuring deliriously and slurring blood into his shirt. He was briefly aware of being put carefully in a car, of letting out soft whimpers that gradually turned into loud sobs as the pain in his body built and built and built. It was getting harder and harder to breathe by the minute, and he was terrified that one of his shattered ribs had punctured his lungs. He couldn't stop the small screams that tore from his mouth with each bump in the road, or the continuous miming from the pain. A hand was gently strolling through his hair, Dabi's voice softly murmuring that everything was going to be okay. Then he was being moved and was screaming because the pain was worse. He was aware of flashing lights and an elderly woman's face. Cover, girl? He grumbled and she laughed softly. Oh honey, I wish I was her. I'm so sorry. She whispered. Her hands glowed green as she placed them on his chest, and then Izuku was thrashing and screaming bloody murder as he felt his broken bones and skin began to knit back together excruciatingly slowly. The woman was murmuring soft apologies in his ear and promising that it would be over soon, but that didn't matter because everything hurt and he couldn't tell what was going on. It was a relief when he finally passed out. By the time they had made it to the actual right location, Izuku Midoriya was gone without a trace. They had managed to shut down an entire branch of villains, But it wasn't the big fish they were after, as Sir Night-Eye had so helpfully explained while yelling at him over the phone. The detective was so tired. It had taken a while to calm down the intelligence hero. When he had explained his reasons, the man had calmed down significantly, eyes narrowed thoughtfully as he considered. Having basically adopted a student at the beginning of this year, Tsukachi had noticed that the man had an increased passion and love for children now, especially children that wanted to be heroes. Although he steadfastly tried to hide it. Sir had demanded to know if Tsukachi had gotten any info on his own little project, seemingly declaring Tsukachi's misfound case as his own and claiming the detective had no right to stop him considering his actions had set the man's own case back by at least a year. The more he had heard, the more disturbed he had looked. "Detective, I don't mean to be rude, but are you sure we are not tracking the growth of what will one day be a S-ranked villain?" He had asked softly, and Tsukachi's jaw had tightened, in frustration and worry. "That's what I'm trying to prevent," he had whispered. Now the two of them were preparing to get into the new evidence. The first thing they had looked at was the blood-splattered journal, the missing one Tsukachi had noticed from the boys' collection a year ago. Night-Eye was calmly examining the pages and reading each one over carefully, humming thoughtfully and nodding slightly. Thorough, devastating analysis on underground heroes and heroes that fought basically quirkless. It was systematic and brutal and explained the attacks that had started occurring on underground agencies these past few months. All in all, a terrifyingly accurate analysis drawn from the bare minimum evidence one could find on these figures. "The kid is a genius," Night-Eye had cautioned him. "We need to warm every hero in this notebook." He sighed softly. Already one hero has been gravely injured to the point of having to retire from this, and 6 companies attacked. If we inform them in time, then the others can prepare and adapt. He blinked, golden eyes thoughtful and a heavy frown on his face. "You would think a child this brilliant would know to write in code?" he whispered, but Tsukachi was already shaking his head. Izuku Midoriya is quirkless and had probably been called worthless and stupid and weak his entire life. Wouldn't surprise me if he didn't think they were good enough to be taken seriously. You should have seen the one I found in his room. It was beat to all hell. Like some kid tried to destroy it with fire," he explained, and anger now rippled across the hero's face. Night-Eye couldn't stand discrimination of any kind, having been bullied relentlessly as a child for his own quirk being creepy and invasive. The hero ran several findings for quirk discrimination awareness groups. It was one of the reasons he had been one of the only heroes to reach out to Mirio with an internship in mind, others not even bothering with the untrained quirk, while all Night-Eye could see was potential. But he also hated when a smart person was belittled to the point of thinking they were stupid. "Do you think we should have Nedzu look at these?" he asked, and a pale look flitted across Tsukachi's face. He shook his head frantically. "I'd rather not have this kid become Nedzu's student," he hissed with wide eyes. The thought of a kid clearly already brimming with such raw, untapped intelligence falling into that creature's paws was objectively the most terrifying thing he had ever heard of. Night-Eye blinked before a similar queasy look flashed across his face. "I'm sorry, I trust Nedzu with my life." Tsukachi rushed to defend himself, but Night-Eye merely shook his head sharply. "No, you're right." The next bits of evidence they had collected to add to the puzzle that was Midoriya Izuku were the hardest to look through. 3 clips. One of the boy being tortured and killing said tormentor, the next of him being rescued by the man covered in scars, and the third of the computer room. The first was appalling and disturbing. Both Night-Eye and he had to take several breaks while watching it, but by the third time looking over at Night-Eye had a confused look on his face. "Look at his eyes, they keep changing," he whispered, and Tsukachi leaned forward, narrowing his own eyes. For the most part, even though snarls of rage were twisting Midoriya's face and his eyes had tears streaming from them, his eyes looked flat and cold. Like a sort of dismissal was being staked here. "That's all you got?" They seemed to glare. Other times they were hard and burning and calculating, like the kid was tearing this man apart with his mind alone and death was imminent, and other times he just looked terrified. "Do you think he has bipolar disorder or something?" Night-Eye asked curiously, but Tsukachi shook his head firmly. "No, I've seen trained Black Ops groups and underground heroes do this. It's like a defense mechanism, like dissociation mixed with did but not." They basically develop masks, a front if you will, that hides their thought process and emotions. But developed to the point that it seems like they're basically a different person. Tsukachi frowned. Night Eye has an equally serious look on his face. Pray tell why a 14-year-old child had to develop this ability. He demanded. Tsukachi just shrugged helplessly, he didn't know. The next video was started and they watched as the boy taunted his attacker about his quirk to lure him in before ripping his throat out with his teeth. The kid acting like the man was his plaything and not the other way around. As if Izuku had been in control of the entire situation even though he wasn't. They watched the mild panic the boy experienced when he couldn't escape from the restraints with his destroyed hands. Blood dripping down from his mouth and smearing on his neck as he cried out in anger and pain. Dissolving into full-on hysterics as the door opened, no doubt thinking an attacker was coming to kill him. Then the scarred individual was there, his back to the camera and calming him while freeing him. His voice was soft and soothing, trying to calm the child. Mikomo! Mikomo, hold still! The scarred individual said loudly but firmly. They had already traced that name and had found no connections. Tsukachi leaned back, rubbing his face. That was, he began. Sad. Night Eye murmured. The next video was even stranger, a injured, clearly struggling Izuku leading his savior to the computer room and having them download everything onto 3 separate drives. He had the man hold the drives up to the camera and then tilted his head, blood dribbling down his chin, arms destroyed and limp and body shaking with pain. The kid raised a single eyebrow at the camera, and then the video feed cut off in a flash of blue. The room he and Night Eye were working in was silent before the man burst out. Are you sure we aren't watching a supervillain origin story? He asked uncertainly, and Tsukachi scowled at the man. Night Eye, please. We don't accuse innocent children of things they haven't done yet. He said simply, and the man shook his head. Besides, Tsukachi pressed on. I don't think he's a bad kid. He's crazy smart, and going off of the interviews I had with his teachers and his quirkless status, he's probably been the victim of severe bullying. Night Eye frowned, his gold eyes dark with thought as he picked up the case file Tsukachi had made in the boy. Reading over it carefully, then pausing. He's involved with Stain? He demanded, and Tsukachi reached over and tapped a note. There is technically no evidence tying Izuku Midoriya to the snake incident where the hero killer showed up to collect the attacker. Just a hunch. Oh, wonderful. Night Eye hadn't sounded that exhausted in years when talking. Tsukachi just grinned at him. Welcome to my world. No thanks, I'm going back to my own. I have training with Mirio in like an hour today and I'm greatly looking forward to it. Text me any advancements you get. Night Eye flipped the case closed and put it back on the desk, stretching slightly with a soft groan before he stood and prepared to leave. Tsukachi went back to staring at the video feed in frustration, carefully looping it. He's probably gonna be off the radar for a couple months while he recovers, so I'm not counting on seeing anything. He shrugged. Night Eye made a soft noise of agreement before wishing him all the luck in the world and leaving. Tsukachi sighed as he stared at the computer with a frown. He was preparing to fast forward through the torture when his phone dinged softly. Curiously, he lifted it, then blinked. No. Please don't charge me for murder. When Izuku woke up, he felt fine. Well, he had a major headache and his stomach was growling so loudly he thought it was trying to carve its way from his midsection. He just groaned and rolled over in his soft bed. He must have forgotten to eat last night. This always happened when he had a hard workout day. He had forgotten to eat and had a terrible nightmare that he had been tortured for hours by the Yakuza while they tried to force him to agree to work for them. Izuku's eyes shot open and he sat bolt upright in the bed, only to wince and clutch at his head as the sharp movement made his headache that much worse. He blinked for a second, allowing his eyes to adjust to the low lighting in the room. This was not his room. It looked more like a hospital room that had clashed with a bedroom, a strange mix of medical equipment and normal bedroom things littering the place. Slowly Izuku blinked and took in his surroundings. He was lying on a normal bed with white sheets and a heart monitor and an IV attached to his arm. The IV was attached to a bag that after a quick inspection he knew was just something to keep him hydrated mixed with a very light painkiller. There was a bedside table with a lamp that he slowly reached over to turn on and froze again. His arm, his hand, it was covered in jagged pink scars that made it look like his hand had either been crushed or shredded violently. A quick look revealed that his other hand was the same. He turned on the light and frowned as he carefully examined both arms, stretching and twisting his fingers and hands. There was only minimal stiffness around his finger joints, something he could easily work out with hand and wrist exercises. He blinked as he pushed his sleeve up, tracing the scar pattern that now danced up his arms and ended just at his elbows. His arms and hands had been the only part of his body besides his face that wasn't heavily scarred. It was a little disappointing to see that was no longer true. "You're awake." He jolted, head flying up. Standing in the doorway was his mentor. Izuku blinked. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes and his body sagging slightly. Weaponless, wearing a gray t-shirt and black pants. Izuku flinched back slightly when he met his teacher's eyes. They were dark with anger and disappointment, and even deeper than that, fear. "Sensei," Izuku began, but the man made a sharp noise to cut him off. "Midoriya, I have rules for a reason. I don't put restrictions on when you go out and where you go simply for fun or to control your actions." Stain stepped into the room and calmly closed the door behind him, walking so he stood right next to Izuku's bed. He sighed heavily and sat down on the edge of the bed, turning to stare at Izuku with a dark intensity. "You are a brilliant child, Midoriya. Smart, powerful, the perfect model for a perfect hero. But you are in fact a child. You haven't finished your training yet and your body is still growing." Izuku narrowed his eyes, jaw clenching as he looked away. Sure, he had wanted this to happen. Had wanted to have new scars decorating his arms. "I'm not saying what happened was your fault, but if you had listened to me and not gone out without me like I told you, it wouldn't have happened at all." His voice was sharp and harsh and Izuku grit his teeth, rage swirling through him before he pushed it back down. His mentor shook his head, sighing heavily before speaking once more. "Do you know just how easy it is to kill someone, Midoriya?" At the words, Izuku gave him a puzzled look. Of course he knew he trained with FING blades every day. He wasn't an idiot. "I know you do, but the reality of a body's fragility doesn't strike you in full force until the first time you've killed someone. You took your first life last night." Izuku flinched back at the memory, pain, desperation, warm blood and flesh that didn't belong to him in his mouth. It had been brutally easy to kill. "You are everything hero society lacks nowadays, Midoriya. A strain of purity and a single all-powerful selfless desire to save people no matter the cost and no matter the reward. Most heroes want it for the money, the power, the fame, the ability to be recognized as something dangerous. But not you. You're going to become a real hero. I've taken steps and measurements to show people how corrupt the system really is. But you're the one that's going to completely change the system." Stain turned to gaze calmly at Izuku and his student blinked. He knew Stain wanted him to be a hero, but he hadn't known exactly why until now. He hadn't cut Stain again since that first cut, but the question slipped from him anyways. "Why do you want to change the hero society?" He peered up at the man, his green eyes shining and a slight frown on his face. "When I was a child, when I went by the name Kaizo Makaguro, I was the proud son of two people that ran a small hero training course. Their students always came out to be strong and powerful heroes that would quickly shoot up to the top 40 heroes. Then one day a villain attacked. My father sent out a distress signal, but no heroes were near our facility, and by the time they arrived my parents were dead." Stain frowned thoughtfully. His voice hadn't stuttered or stammered during this explanation. His face was dark and angry. "When I found out, I was devastated. I closed the school and after doing some research quickly found out that there were several cases exactly like mine. Curious and confused, I did more research and found that lost heroes don't even patrol the downtown areas, and when they do they ignore most crime because there aren't any cameras to catch the fights. It went deeper than though. That was how I found out just how disgustingly corrupt the world around me was. I want you to be better than that, Midoriya." He turned to face Izuku and gently placed a hand on top of Izuku's head. His face gentle as he smiled at the young teen. "I set up my rules to protect you. I trusted you to follow them. I believed that you would follow them. But you didn't, and you nearly died. You've lost my trust, little hero. You have to earn it back now, but until then, I'm paying Dobby to keep an eye on you and stay with you at all times. As an insurance to make sure you don't run around and get captured again. Be nice to our host here, she'll be coming in to check up on you. We'll be headed home in 2 hours' time. He stood, and without another word or glance back, he left the room. Izuku stared blankly after him. There had never been a time in his life where an adult had actually cared about his well-being. His mother had pretended, but her fear and worry was more of the choking sort, the kind that wrapped you up in its grasp and squeezed the life out of you. He had thought the rules and restrictions Stain put on him was due to the fact that Stain wanted him to maintain a healthy schedule, and he had had no idea it was to protect him. The concept of being protected was foreign to Izuku. The image of the disappointed half-smile Stain had sent him when he ruffled his hair flashed through his mind, and Izuku's face screwed up. A sharp feeling pounded through his chest, tightening in his throat, and he struggled not to let it. Hissing at himself in his thoughts that only weak Deku's cried. But in the end, nothing could stop the heavy sobs that ripped from as he turned on his side, curling up tightly and burst into tears. He had broken his master's trust in him, and that knowledge was devastating. The woman that healed him was in her late 50s. She had soft blue eyes and was just as tiny and stooped as Recovery Girl, with her silvery hair gathered into a high bun. Unlike Recovery Girl, her face was thinner and she wore a blue sweater and black pants. She didn't have a cane either. You should be fine now. She chirped sweetly, a small smile rippling across her face after thoroughly checking over Izuku's wounds. My quirk works wonders. I call it instant heal. And Izuku perked up at that, wildly curious. The woman told him to call her Ayasu and happily explained her quirk to him as she handed him his fresh, clean clothes. He had only just realized he was wearing one of Dobby's long-sleeved shirts that all but swallowed his small frame and had been mortified. Her quirk was almost identical to Recovery Girl, who was actually her cousin. The only difference was that the people she healed were forced to feel the pain of how they received the wound times almost 100. Izuku shuddered at the memory of an all-consuming pain gnawing at his body from the night before, and she gave him a sympathetic look. Unfortunately, my quirk doesn't work if the person I'm healing has any medicine or drugs in their system. It was deemed a harsh quirk by our government, and I was told not to use it and to settle back and live quietly as a citizen. But I got my medical license and I use it. She smiled a kind smile at Izuku, and he smiled back. I created a system for people in the downtown district to come to me for healing. Instead of money, they exchange goods for my services. Again she smiled widely. Izuku leaned forward, interest sparking through him. And how am I repaying your kindness, Ayasu? He asked with a slight smile. The woman had an amused gleam in her eye and simply shook her head at him. Just keep cleaning that beach, young man. I'd say that's worth 10 uncharged visits with me if you clear it. And Izuku suddenly wanted to write this down in his notebook. Exchanging services and needed goods for the betterment and improvement of a community. The brief thought flickered through his mind of a hero organization that operated on that kind of basis. Less on money and more on exchange and protection. It would draw the civilians into their work just enough to make the citizens feel like they were connected with their heroes on a more delicate level. Creating an altogether tighter community intent upon helping each other simply because their hero suggested it after they saved their life. The stress of an almost death implanting that thought right after a traumatic experience. Izuku shook his head. He really shouldn't be thinking about manipulating civilians like that. But would it honestly be a bad thing if the average everyday person felt more safe and happy? More connected with their neighborhood? It could even help with more troublesome issues that were often ignored. Quirk discrimination, class discrimination, race, species. Weave the community bond tighter and tighter until they were no longer curling strands of an iron bristle but rather one large shield of beaten and weathered metal. Side effects would probably be a slight rise in vigilantes, but a third of the current underground heroes were reformed vigilantes anyways. Often the more stealth-based heroes would all but adopt the vigilantes that had been rejected from hero courses or society. Midoriya. He jolted slightly as Ayasu tore him from his thoughts. The old woman quirked a brow with a slightly amused smirk. That's truly an amazing thought process to have, and I highly encourage you to continue down that road, but perhaps don't mutter your plans like that. She smiled, and again Izuku felt mortification sweep through him. "Ah, yes, ma'am," he mumbled. The second they got back to the warehouse, Izuku unceremoniously dragged Dabi back to his apartment. "Need your help with something? Sensei isn't restarting my training until next week, which is stupid, but whatever." Dabi just growled half-heartedly. Izuku could feel the tension in the man's arms under his fingers and knew without a doubt he was barely tolerating Izuku dragging him around like this. "I don't want to go to your shitty but apartment, you tiny fucker." He spit, but there was no real heat behind the words, and Izuku blew him off easily. He dragged Dabi into his living room and promptly started removing his notebooks from the shelf and tossing them onto the couch. Then he turned to his desk with the computer on it and opened one of the drawers, quickly pulling out a smaller black book. He turned back to find Dabi standing with a vastly uncomfortable look on his face, blue eyes flickering all over the place. "Sit." Izuku barked, and he glared down at Izuku. "Just because I'm now your FING babysitter doesn't mean I have to take orders from you." He glared, and Izuku glared right back. Dabi has been baiting him the entire ride here, and Izuku just knew the scarred man was itching for a fight. He'd get one, of course. Izuku wanted to see what kind of limitations the new stiffness in his hands would give him until he worked through it. But his experience with the Yakuza had revealed something to Izuku. His analysis might actually be dangerous. Of course, it was something Stain was having him trained to focus and sharpen his skills, but until the interrogation with the quiet man, Izuku had just assumed it was a small, harmless hobby. Nothing too drastic. He had always been told growing up that it was the ridiculous ramblings of a hero fanboy, stupid and immature. Still, ever since Stain had started him on improving his analysis, he had developed a 20-point code just in case his notes ever somehow became dangerous and less ridiculous. "You can stand for the next few hours then. After all, I don't really need you until I'm finished." He smiled sweetly, allowing just enough of this new idea he was working towards to show on his face. His thoughts of a hero company based on equivalent exchange and strength in community had led him to the rather stunning realization that absolutely none of the masks he currently wore around others, not even his true feelings and emotions, would inspire that kind of confidence in people. Not right away, at least. He needed a hero side. Someone with charisma and charm like All Might, that fearless presence, but also someone relatable, an empathetic figure you could see as human. He had settled on something similar to Deku, but less fearful and full of terror. He needed to work it until it became a perfect sort of mask like Mikumo. But hopeful, by the time he had settled into this persona, he was portraying it would be a kind, unassuming, confident kid that you could place your worries in. Something similar to how he had been before he was 4. So nervously he tried to let his first attempt at it shine through the smile. The absolutely disturbed look Dabi sent him told him it was an epic failure. "Cut that sheet out, you look creepy as all hell." He shuddered, and Izuku sighed, shaking his head. It needed work then. He marched into his laundry room and climbed his stepladder, pulling the large box of empty notebooks he kept in there down and marching back to the living room. He sat easily and opened one of his older analysis books, carefully beginning to translate the words into code on his new notebook. He could see Dabi hovering out of the corner of his eye and made sure not to acknowledge the elder. Dabi would sit and work with him in just a few minutes. And sure enough, not even 10 minutes later, when Izuku was already a fourth of the way through the notebook, he finally sat down next to Izuku and blinked over his shoulder at the odd series of shapes and slashed trailing from his pen in place of words. "What are you doing?" he demanded gruffly. "The Yakuza found one of my old notebooks. They've been using it to attack underground heroes. I didn't even know my notes were good enough for that sheet. I've been playing with the idea of rewriting my notes in code, but I didn't get the chance until now. If you want to help, that black notebook is the key, and you can learn the code and start translating." Izuku continued his frantic scribbling as Dabi also set to work next to him. All in all, it took them about 10 hours to translate all 28 of Izuku's notebooks. 6 or 7 of them are not an analysis, just plans and vague ideas. Now what? Dabi yawned into the soup Izuku had made. Izuku blinked from where he was now carefully shelving his new notebooks. Now we sleep the couch is a pull-out if you don't want to go to that room sensei set aside for you. In the morning we're gonna burn my old books. But tonight Izuku had more pressing plans. He went to his room as Dabi grudgingly pulled out the pull-out, whipping out his phone and staring nervously at the number he had entered into his contacts. How should he approach the situation? What mask should he wear when confronting the detective that he had only just found was following his steps? Although why exactly baffled Izuku? He really couldn't understand it. He also needed to make sure he didn't get a murder charge on his record even if it was in self-defense. Now seemed as good a time as any to don his new mask. Although he had yet to name it, and the detective wouldn't see his abysmal facial expressions yet. Izuku Midoriya. Please don't charge me for murder. Message read. Why am we doing this? Why am I letting you do this? Why is Sensei letting you do this? Izuku smirked out the window of the car as Dabi ranted. The elder man had been rambling to both Izuku and Hina about how this was a bad FNG idea, since Izuku had announced his plan 3 days ago. It had been 1 week since Izuku's capture and rescue from the Yakuza. Just 1 week and Izuku's world had once again seemed to flip upside down. He had talked with the detective every day for several hours a day, getting a feel for the man's mind and his speech, all the while steadily building up his own mask. He had decided to leave it unnamed for now, but Dabi had grudgingly admitted that Izuku seemed like a different person when using it, so it must be working at least a little. He had donned that mask for what he was about to do now. Shy, soft, sweet, a bit of a crybaby, someone that wasn't weak or in need of protection, that could maybe be a bit dangerous. But only if they ever actually worked up the spine to attack others. Izuku had found he quite liked the mask. It reminded him of when he was younger before he got the quirkless diagnosis. As if it's a disease? His mind snarled, the way he had been a star pupil right alongside Kabaku. He had felt unstoppable then, had only wanted to love others and be loved back. Had thought the only thing he could do in the world was save people because no one deserved to die unheard. No one. One life lost for no reason was a waste. Back then adults had called him a natural-born hero. Then, after his doctor's visit, it was called sheer stupidity and idolization of an unattainable dream. Tsukachi Izuku has come to find was not one of those adults. He was good, strong, and thoughtful. He hadn't shown any sign over text that he thought Izuku was a waste of space or worthless. Apparently he had been tracking Izuku for almost the entire year, and 2 months Izuku had been missing. Which meant he was persistent, that may be a problem if Izuku ever actually wanted to disappear, and patient. Incredibly patient. A dangerous combination. He had explained to Izuku that as they hadn't planned to arrest Izuku for his actions when being tortured, that he had no grounds for anything if they were to meet in person. Bafflingly enough, the detective really seemed to just want to talk to Izuku, and it was with that realization that Izuku had gone straight to his sensei, now Dabi sensei as well. The elder had been roped into sword, knife, and fighting lessons with Izuku's mentor, even though his instincts had whispered that this was his secret and he needed to protect it. He was still trying to earn Stain's trust in him back after all. The restrictions to his life were slight, barely noticeable, but they were there. Red flags that quietly whispered, "I don't trust you alone," in Izuku's ears. Stain had told him it would be a good thing to have connections in the police force and to continue on with this train of thought. But not to go alone, and to take Hina and Dabi with him. Give him an analysis on his quirk. See how he reacts to it, try and impress him. His mentor had said calmly, and Izuku had nodded, mind spinning. He had politely asked, and Tsukachi had readily sent him a small description of his quirk. Lie detector, the ability to sense when someone was telling the truth or lying. Izuku had been utterly thrilled at the prospect. How did that quirk work? Did he feel the lie? Or was it a noise that rang when someone lied? Did it run on half-truths as well? If Izuku was to say, "All Might is the #1 hero," would it ring both true and false? In the context of Izuku's own thoughts, he was lying. But in the context of society, it was a normal fact. Was it just a feeling that cropped up? Did it transcend all languages? Did it work on nonverbal languages? Did it work over electronics? If Izuku was to momentarily convince himself that a lie was a truth, would it ring as truthful? God, Izuku had sped through at least 10 pages of notes on it, then had cursed upon the realization that he was writing in code and had painstakingly rewritten everything in kanji to give to the man. He had recently started writing only in code, something that was sure to bite him in the butt should he ever choose to rejoin society. Tsukachi never pushed at Izuku's boundaries, which Izuku loved. It gave him all the control over their conversations, stroking that little bubble inside him that wanted to hold and move things how he wanted. A distant part of him was a little worried this was the beginnings of yet another mask. Another larger part worried that this all-consuming section of his mind wasn't a mask at all. So Izuku had to ask the question in the long run. A simple text he sent last night, after asking his sensei for permission, that had left him feeling strangely queasy and nervous. Izuku Midoriya. I really want to meet you if that would be okay with you? I'll be at Dagoba Beach at 3 p.m. tomorrow if you can. I'm sorry and I know this sounds so shady but please come alone. New people make me a little nervous? Grinning face with sweat. The reply had been a swift affirmative, and now Izuku was riding with Dabi to his beach. He wasn't allowed to drive anymore, which was ridiculous, and this past week had taken to coming with Dabi to clean the beach. It only had about a month's worth of debris left scattered everywhere, much to Izuku's delight. But when Dabi had first seen the beach he had snorted so hard Izuku was concerned. Jesus, Mikumo! He had laughed behind the wheel of the truck. Dabi always called him Mikumo when he was feeling playful, and Izuku didn't know how to tell him that the name now sent violent shivers down his spine, made his scars prickle and itch and his jaw ache with phantom pains. Along with slimy panic crawling up his throat, and an obsessive need to check his surroundings. You've been cleaning this shithole up? He had grinned, blue eyes all but shining with humor, scars glinting in the sunlight, even as Izuku had turned a violent shade of red and hidden his face in his hands, mumbling an affirmation. God, you are such a hero. He snorted, and Izuku had all but snarled at him. This was precisely why he hadn't told anyone about his project. But now when they pulled up to the beach Izuku only relaxed, well aware that Dabi would stay in the truck and read while Izuku worked. They had arrived an hour early because Izuku had a plot of sand he needed to clean today and had rented the machine that would wash it. Plus he wanted to look like he was busy when Tsukachi got here. In the back seat Hina leaned forward. Her clear silver eyes almost glowed with excitement as she took in the beach before them. And Izuku could see her hands clenching down on the car seats, making the new leather gloves she wore stretch and squeak slightly. Izuku sighed, having expected this, and felt a fleet of nervous embarrassment rush through him as she turned to him with the most betrayed look. Courtesy of his new mask. Aizu-kun, how could you keep this from me? She looked half heartbroken and half feral, which was an odd look on her. Hina had long silky black hair that fell around her face, so perfectly wavy and smooth it looked like fresh waves of black ink spilling down her body. Her skin was an unblemished dark toffee brown, and while her eyes were distinctly Japanese in shape, the set of her mouth, high cheekbones, her longer, more oval face paired with a strong nose and jaw revealed her Arabic heritage, her mother's side of the family. But in Izuku's opinion, her most striking feature was her eyes. They were the kind of silvery gray one saw on a brand new coin or in a bottle of mercury. Swirling and crisp and clear, they were unnerving to some people. Izuku had a theory that she looked so flawless and perfect, beautiful. She was beautiful. Even Izuku, who had never been attracted to a person in his life, was a little stunned by her beauty because of her quirk. You agreed to not interfere with my project when I said you could come. Izuku flushed and she snorted. Izuku, it's a cleaning project. How dare you keep me from it? Her voice, soft and lower-pitched, was curled with mocking betrayal. Izuku laughed awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. I'm trying to rebuild an ecosystem on a heavily polluted beach, and I don't want you to accidentally use your quirk in such a widespread area that is connected to the ocean. You could accidentally kill yourself and the ocean's ecosystems if you touch the water. She blinked. Hina's quirk reacted like a terrible chain explosion in water. Her parents had learned when she was 5 not to let her in lakes, streams, or the ocean after she cleaned a pond on accident, killing all the bacteria and over-scrubbing the water, causing all the living organisms in the lake to die overnight as the water turned crystal clear. Hina had been sent into severe quirk shock from the impact of it and been bedridden for nearly 2 months from the strain. Thinking back on it, Izuku was actually pretty sure she wasn't allowed near large bodies of water, and if police caught her they would be on grounds to arrest her. Obviously I wouldn't be using my quirk. I just want to help, just let me sift the sand through the sand cleaning machine you brought. She chirped, and Izuku smiled faintly, amused and a little touched at her obvious enthusiasm. Sorry Hina, but don't natural bodies of water have a restraining order against you? He grinned when she gave him a wounded look while Dabi turned to give them an utterly astonished look. Effing you what? He demanded. Hina huffed defensively and leaned back in her seat with her arms crossed. So maybe my quirk is actually pretty dangerous, it overcleans water. She explained promptly. Dabi blinked with a slightly hesitant look on his face. She's one of the top 100 most regulated humans on the quirk safety and regulation list. Izuku replied cheerfully, trying for the new flippant way his new mask would reveal ground-shattering information. Not because he was trying to be flippant, but because his new mask truly believed it was common knowledge. What, I brought a chick that's on like 12 federal watch lists to one of the places she's not supposed to be within 20 yards of? Dabi shrieked, his voice jumping several octaves. Izuku smiled slightly. So Dabi had been raised in a house that worked closely with the government. There was no way the man knew exactly how many agencies handled this type of thing from a random book he read. Izuku only knew that information because his sensei was forcing him to memorize all the laws and regulations and efforts put into hero work and keeping society safe. Dabi was probably raised around a special detective high up in the system or a high-ranking hero. Ruling out all the heroes should be easy. It would be a pain if it was a high-ranking agent though. Get out of the car and grab your sheet, Izuku. I need to get this beach home before she sets off alarms. Hina whined loud protests at the words. Crawling up to the front and angrily pinching at Dabi's skin, he hissed out a snarl, turning and giving her an extremely disapproving look. As he scolded her fiercely and passionately, another puzzle piece clicked Izuku's mind. Elder brother? He was at least a sibling and had most likely taken care of his sibling at some point. You're leaving me alone? He asked curiously, and Dabi froze. No sheet. He groaned before turning to shove Hina back. You lay down on the bottom of the truck bed and take a nap or some sheet play on your phone, but stay down, God. You go get to FING work. He pointed threateningly at Izuku, and Izuku nodded and hopped out of the car. As he did, he saw Dabi rip open the glove compartment and almost tear out a book in it. After that, it was a fairly simple task of Izuku just moving to fix things, sorting all the trash, mostly small things now, nothing like the fridges and cars and huge pieces of metal and wood that had originally been here. He fell into the rhythm he always fell into on this beach, muscles straining and meticulously cleaning each patch of land, combing through buckets of sand to work out any trash and glass and oil. He was so engrossed that he truly forgot the time, didn't notice it flying past on his watch, so caught up in his work that nothing could tear his attention from it. Izuku Midoriya? The voice was kind and curious, and Izuku jolted, jostling the sloshing bucket of sand and salt water he had just started running through the machine he had bought to clean out any oil. He turned and blinked in surprise. The man standing across from him wasn't dressed in a suit like he'd thought he would be. No, Detective Tsukachi was dressed in a simple black t-shirt tucked into a pair of tan jeans cinched tight with a belt. He wore normal tennis shoes, and paired with his bland face and hair, he looked like the most boring, unassuming person Izuku had ever met. But he wasn't. Izuku could see his badge hooked onto his hip. No doubt he had a concealed firearm on himself somewhere, and those brown eyes were shining with the same hard intelligence Izuku knew he himself possessed. But Izuku was better at hiding that than this man. He didn't want Tsukachi to see Izuku Midoriya, who had been brutally trained through the past year, who had been sharpened to a fine point, who hyper-fixated on things and could tear apart a situation in seconds. He wanted Tsukachi to see a determined, sweet kid. One who never gave up and was maybe too stubborn for their own good. Soft and shy and kind to a fault, but strong and resilient. Detective. He smiled widely, allowing his eyes to crinkle as he straightened, a smile Izuku had practiced 1,000 times in the mirror. I'm really happy you came. He laughed, kicking at the now clean soggy sand. I didn't think you would. He added lightly, and Tsukachi frowned as he stepped forward. Of course I would. I've been dying to meet you, kid. You're slippery. He laughed and Izuku grinned sheepishly, then jolted as if he remembered something, rushing to his backpack which was on the sea wall and pulling out a notebook. I made an analysis of your quirk. He yelled, rushing back over, getting close to the detective. He could see the man's eyes flickering over the thick scars twisting over Izuku's hands and arms, and fought the urge to shrink back or stiffen. Then he realized that was something his mask would do and allowed himself to curl back from the detective. Really? Tsukachi quirked a small smile as he reached for the notebook, but there was a slightly guilty light in his eyes. I'm terrified. He deadpanned and Izuku laughed, lips spread in a true smile. He could see a warmth shining through the grown-up's eyes and it made him relax slightly. Izuku decided right then and there that he liked Tsukachi. Didn't trust him, but he liked him. The kid was a mystery wrapped up in an angelic aura. Tsukachi had been texting him for the better part of the past week and had quickly come to realize that the kid didn't have an ounce of self-worth. And what he did have he wielded like a double-edged knife, cutting into others but also into himself. Tsukachi smiled as he took the notebook, wondering idly if Izuku himself realized that Tsukachi's quirk went deeper than just words. He could sense the front the young teen was shoving forward, but he could also tell that it wasn't entirely a front. That on some subconscious level the boy wasn't projecting but showing a different side of himself he'd never considered. Still, it was impressive. If Tsukachi had met this child just 5 years ago, he never would have sensed the truth behind his movements. Looking at the analysis, he was a little floored. The easy, confident way the boy had drawn conclusions and dug into Tsukachi's quirk. On the very little information he had given him was frightening and awe-inspiring all at once. Easily uncovering the nuances and double standards of his quirk. How to work around or through the quirk. It was even better work than what Tsukachi had read in the boy's hero analysis books. The part of the detective that was tied to the people, to protecting them and keeping the world safe at any cost, itched and trembled deep in his chest with the sudden desire to lock this child away. To have him carefully monitored and trained, to maybe have his record changed to say he had an analysis quirk so people would take the kid seriously. Maybe then it wouldn't seem so ridiculous to most. The idea that quirks determined whether someone was dangerous was a ridiculous notion Tsukachi had been fighting against for years. It had led to the birth of some of the most terrifying villains he had ever seen. Villains like Diligence, Crybaby, Petal. Dangerous, horrifying individuals that he had barely caught and were locked deep in Tartarus. This is very good, Tsukachi said quietly after reading through it. He looked up to see a pleased smile on Izuku's face. Genuine. But I get the feeling you didn't just call me here for a leisurely chat and to show off your analysis? He examined the kid, recalling the way he had told him his sensei had gotten him help over text. The way he talked about his sensei with such clear trust and devotion had instilled a deep pit of nausea in Tsukachi's chest. Had him recalling another man that loved catching and helping vulnerable people that had been beaten down by the world, exactly like Izuku. He had had to gently remind himself that that particular blight upon the world was no more. Destroyed at long last. Izuku had clearly healed from his brief and intense torture. Tsukachi would bet $60 that had been in contact with Ayasu. The old woman kept a very low profile, but there was no one else registered with a quirk like hers besides Recovery Girl. Izuku's arms and hands were covered in thick dark pink scars. They were fresh and looked as if his skin had been brutally torn, as if it had simply torn apart from pressure, like they had been crushed. Tsukachi didn't doubt that his chest and maybe even some of his back was covered in those scars as well. But here he was, green eyes sparkling, dark hair curling around his face and ears, cut short on the sides in a buzz cut. One of his ears had a nick in it as if a knife or something had cut a small corner out. No. The boy coughed and his cheeks were bright red. He shuffled awkwardly and cast his eyes down to their feet, not shy or embarrassed, bashful maybe? I wanted you to consider taking me on as an intern for quirk analyst. And at those words Tsukachi's heart practically vibrated with joy. It would be the perfect way to keep the boy with him. Tsukachi didn't know what had happened to Izuku Midoriya in the year it had been since he'd been reported missing, but quite frankly Tsukachi didn't believe any of the official sheet on this boy's form. Someone with a lot of influence was pulling strings. If he kept Midoriya with him, not only could he investigate who exactly was the boy's keeper at the moment, he could also try and make sure they weren't drilling their own ideals into his mind, gaslighting or manipulating him. In spite of all that he had read the boy's notebooks and knew without a doubt that that original keen emotion to stop and listen had undoubtedly begun to be honed into an actual weapon. Meaning he couldn't just go about this as he normally would. He had to make Midoriya believe in his own lies. It was a little ironic. Tsukachi hated lies and manipulative behavior, and yet here he was, planning on stepping into a relationship where both he and the other person attempted to pull each other the way they wanted to achieve their goals. He pretended to let his eyes widen slightly with appraisal and shock, rocking back on his heels and humming as he reached a hand up to cup his jaw as he ished in a loud, surprised breath. I don't know, Midoriya, you're only 14 and haven't even sent in an application to any high school yet. Your skills are exceptional, but I need to talk with your high school teachers to work out a schedule with them to set this in motion, not to mention it's mostly on hero or third-year law students that get internships with my team. Midoriya twitched in front of him, seemingly trying to curl into himself in a small defensive way. Looking away, his hands shook and he shoved them deep into his pockets, looking away. I'm waiting for my sensei to help me decide what schools to apply to. I haven't decided if I even want to leave homeschool yet. He mumbled, and Tsukachi's heart aches for the boy, for the clear anxiety swimming up in his throat and threading through his words. I can talk with Sakura. She is our head of HR and could probably help determine this. But just know I will be pushing for this to happen. I just need certain information first. He soothed easily. The boy relaxed and blinked a little tearfully at Tsukachi. The detective smiled widely back. In the meantime, why don't you tell me what you've been doing here at Dagoba Beach? He asked and watched the nerves melt right off this boy. He smiled a blindingly sweet smile and launched into a truly staggering and informational breakdown of knowledge about Japan's recycling and trash industry, providing no less than 76 reasons it evidently is so bad. Leeches looked like light kissers. Truly, Tsukachi loved talking to youth. Breathe. The word reverberated like the bang of a gong through Bakugo's skull, bringing him out of the red haze of anger that normally painted his vision. Find 3 things around you. Tell me what they look like. As usual, Dr. Miura's voice felt whisper-thin in his mind, like some kind of foreign touch that made his skin itch and a vague feeling of nausea claw its way up his throat. And as usual, he ignored that and looked. He cast his eyes around. The UA gates were in front of him, open, glinting a dull blue-gray in the sunlight. Who the F kept their metal gates so clean and rust-free but didn't paint them? The pavement in front of him was also very perfect and clear, no crack and an almost white tan, and what kind of sidewalk looked this neat? His eyes flitted over UA itself, having been warned several times not to focus on things that were too bright and colorful when he was doing this. Was a kid walking through the gates. Bakugo's eyes didn't train on the rather obvious mutation quirk the kid was carrying, but rather his thick black hair laying neatly down against his head. He was a little darker skinned, and he cast Bakugo an almost confused look as he passed. Heavy-set eyes and a long nose, paired with a strong jaw. Mexican? Latino? Bakugo wasn't sure, but he definitely wasn't full Japanese, although it was hard to really tell ethnicity from looks nowadays. He was probably confused as to why some kid had stopped in the entrance. Bakugo let his eyes trail over the kid's mutation, taking in the rounded-off elbows and the small openings. Kind of like a tape dispenser. He tilted his head. That was really FING weird? Deku would know what to say about it. He'd go crazy over it. Squeaking out in his annoying FNG voice, Kaken, do you think it gives him the same mobility as the Spider-Man hero from America? I think he'd be a little more hindered due to direction but increased flexibility, and at that point Bakugo would promptly blow up. Just the thought of the useless F's voice sent cold sweat and pure rage trickling down his spine to settle heavy in his gut, as if he'd swallowed a ball of hot iron. The same restrictive collar-like feeling tightening around his throat as Dr. Miura's voice whispered its restraints. The gleaming brown eyes of the doctor flashed through his mind and Bakugo snarled slightly, forcing himself to straighten and walk into his future school. He had been stuck there, like a coward, like he was weak. He wasn't FNG weak, Because of the demon nerd, the idle worry that he'd see Deku at the exam having wiggled its way into his mind the same way a worm would push through wet soil. Not worry, anger, annoyance. Why would that be here? If he was here, Bakugo would kill him. He better be here. He'd choke him out until that light shriveled and died, and he'd go home where? Come on, Katsuki-san, you know the rules. Don't dwell on violent thoughts. Dr. Moira's voice curled in his skull, and the thoughts slid away like hot oil. Not there any longer, but clinging to his mind as if they were. Everything was Deku's fault. It was all his fault. It had to be. Bakugo had to push down the niggling doubt that was the lack of Deku in his school for the past year and a half. The doctor's visits increasing, this stupid rope, all of it had to be the useless freak's fault, because why else? See, this is why your parents put you in anger management, Katsuki-san. You need to curb that pride and arrogance. Why else would he be in this shithole if not for Deku? It had to be his fault, or else it was Katsuki's fault, and he didn't do anything to deserve this. Then shut the F up, you stupid moronic, he managed to hold in his scream of fury as he beat back the terror that had momentarily climbed its way up from his stomach and nestled down like a poisonous gas in his lungs, choking out what little oxygen he could get. You are going to take this test. You're gonna show mom and dad that you don't need to see Dr. Miura anymore. You are going to be a hero. Bakugo squared his shoulders and raised his head. Nothing would stop him. He had one goal and one goal only. Be the strongest, and never have anyone look down on him again. Do well on your test for me, Katsuki-sen. Dr. Miura laughed breathily in his mind. Bakugo straightened and squared his jaw. There was no way that FNG nerd would be here. The written exam was almost laughably easy. Bakugo sped through the questions, feeling almost offended at how truly simple they were. The only thing that started to give him problems was the English portion and the hero laws and regulations section. Yeah, he wasn't FING good at goddamn English, and he only knew what all citizens knew about hero laws. So half of that sheet was guesswork. He tried to ignore the momentary terror that clawed up his throat, that all-consuming sense of failure. He could feel his quirk popping ever so slightly in his palms from the stress of it. His mind latching onto that stupid segment, mocking the questions and ethical lines. Is quirk use permitted in a house? Are special quirk requirements almost freely met, or is there a fine? How many types of hero liability insurances are there, and what kinds? And Bakugo didn't know because that sheet wasn't public knowledge. Only heroes and police officers and lawyers and attorneys and hero agencies knew that crap. Not FNG 14-year-old kid. The drive buzzed through his brain even as Present Mike announced the limits of the physical. His mind noting that he basically just needed to murk as many of the FING tin cans as possible. Avoid 0-pointers, whatever. It's not like it'd take him long to kill that sheet. But he had to make up for the missed points he knew he missed on the FING test. Deku wouldn't have missed those points, and he started to run through his known moves. Mind rattling off the projectiles and strengths of the 6 different explosion types he had figured out how to create with his quirk. Picking and choosing quickly. It looked like he'd be fighting in a cityscape and with all the other examies in his group, which meant that he couldn't go all out. Which immediately meant no blast 3.0. He could only use flight blast intermittently because it had a tendency to make bigger explosions the longer he used it all at once, meaning he should strictly use it to get to targets that were only over 10 yards away. It seemed like a mixture of Propel Blast and Blast 2.0 were going to be his main weapons in this. Propel was his newest and least tried, but it was dead useful and easy to use against predictable opponents. He'd use that with his right hand and his Blast 2.0 with his left. And he didn't doubt that the more robots he defeated, the harder it would get. He wouldn't put it past that principal rat motherfucker to have several secret scales to measure students by. Undoubtedly, the more robots you beat, the higher your threat level showed in their radar. Meaning the more points you'd score based on skill as well as efficiency to follow the test code. Just how hard was it really to reach that shiny 45 points you needed? Thousands of people with hard combat quirks like his applied here every year, but only 40 managed to make it? No, the Metal FS had to up their destruction the more you nerfed. He'd bet there was even some secret point system out in place for those kids that simply, genuinely couldn't handle S-rank villains, but would still make amazing heroes. Bakugo's brain ticked as he followed his training group to the changing rooms to change into his gym clothes. He puzzled over it then snorted. Of course. Besides fighting villains, heroes also saved people. Undoubtedly there was probably some search and rescue point basis, and although there was no class that he knew of, undoubtedly they had some type of espionage point crap for the kids that would one day be tracking the real nasty shit through the underground. After all, only around 7 out of the normal 10 or 13 students that would graduate from UA's hero course became media or rescue heroes, the rest seemingly disappearing in the wind. But he eyed the other boys around him as he slipped his black muscle shirt over his head. Well, these FS were trying to be heroes, which meant they didn't deserve to be treated like civilians in Bakugo's mind. UA has one of the most dangerous practical exams in the entire Asian continent. Only rivaled by that one weird FING hero school in Russia, but Russia was, well, Russia. There had been several instances where people tried to sue UA for their child losing a finger or sustaining severe nerve damage from the exam, which changed every year. But you and your legal guardians were forced to sign an NDA when you took this exam. These kids knew that, and quite frankly, Bakugo didn't care if the kid with the jaw quirk beside him got injured. He wasn't going to treat them like civilians when they were trying to be heroes. Which meant he wouldn't be doing any rescue sheet, and since he'd be treating them like fellow heroes, no espionage sheet either. So he'd have to get his points purely through combat. Bakugo inhaled slowly, uncurling his fingers from where they had been digging into his palm and allowing his sparklers to dance across his palm, just to alleviate some of the nitroglycerin. He didn't want that sheet dripping after all. And when he was stressed, it tended to practically soak his hands. What was worse was he couldn't even FANG feel it, the stupid FING tendons and bones in his hands, wrists, arms, shoulder and spine reinforced to be able to absorb heavy shocks. It had been bad when he was younger, constantly injuring people and destroying things around him. The nerves in his hands were so dull he had to take physical therapy classes to know he was moving his hands correctly. Not just oddly clenching them. All right, you have 30 minutes to get the amount of points required. Present Mick's voice boomed as Bakugo looked around the other students around him. It was a cityscape. And go! He howled and Bakugo was off like a rocket, jumping as high as he could without his quirk. Last he had measured he was able to jump nearly 6 feet straight up without a boost, before using propel to shoot over the other students' heads. The battle was just as gruesome as he'd anticipated. The first few robots tore like butter beneath the force of Blast 2.0, he didn't even really have to use propel to move. But by the 7th robot it was significantly harder. He was having to shift between hands. Forever grateful that he had started learning to use both his hands in a fight. It was maybe by his 3rd or 4th robot that he began to detect their increase in speed, knowledge and attack patterns. His body twisting wildly as the robots came at him faster, harder, and more deadly than before. His body snapping around, forcing himself to twist and contort, and forever grateful his mother had put him in gymnastics as a child and the ballerina sheet had stuck with his butt. It was a lot harder than even he thought it would be, and by the end of it he was panting and shaking, shoulders heaving and a snarl etched across his face, teeth bared and eyes narrowed to slits. His throat felt strangely clogged and he realized with a jolt that kids near him had gone silent, staring at him with rounded and almost scared eyes. The whispers steadily reaching his ears as his awareness trickled back. Did you see? He didn't even notice. What the F, that was scary. Holy shit. Is he really going to be a hero? He looked like a villain. It was the last words of some small blue-haired extra that caused Bakugo to snap back into his body. Dr. Miura's words floating through his mind. Everyone praises the ground you walk on, but honestly a quirk like yours would be more suited for villainy, and with the way you're spinning I wouldn't be surprised. Nausea rushed through Bakugo's stomach and up his throat as he examined the dead robots around him, his eyes widening in shock as he noticed the huge strips of metal littered everywhere connecting to an absolutely monstrous robot. Had he done that? Swallowing harshly, Bakugo straightened, only now becoming aware of the pain lacing through his wrists and shoulders, of the light burns on his hands he got from overuse of his quirk. Is everyone okay? He cast his eyes around, counting the students that were steadily trickling to the area and relaxing when he counted out 50. The extras were fine. Everything was fine, he hadn't hurt anyone. Anger clawed its way up his throat and out of his mouth in a slight snarl as he stalked from the ring of machinery around him, easily blasting away some of the pieces. Stop gawking. He spat at the other kids as he marched past them. All that mattered was that he would be a hero, not what these kids thought, or his parents, or Dr. Ivanji Miura. He'd show all these fuckers he was the best. Aizawa Shoyuda was exhausted. He was so tired, and after today he was even more tired. He should have kept at least one kid from his class last year, then he could have sidestepped the shot show that was his upcoming class with ease. He glared down at his desk in the teacher's room, scowling fiercely at the long list of students for a second before angrily opening up the briefcase Nedzu had provided him with analysis of each student as well as their record. Not that Aizawa much cared for official records, those could get twisted fast and cruelly by one hateful teacher or petty principal. But he still had to read them in case there was something actually important in them, like a disability or severe quirk side effect. Calmly he began to organize the folders from least troubling to most troubling, writing on a separate piece of paper what he thought might be their main problem. Tenya Ida inflexibility. Ryuma Yuga self-doubt. Shrityu self-doubt. Momo Yayorozu self-worth. Toru Hagakure self-worth. Ejiro Kirishima self-worth. Mashireo Ojiro self-worth. Fumikage Tokoyami lack of trust and control in and with his own quirk. Hantas Siro mild language barrier, self-worth. Mizo Shoji self-hatred and disgust. Kyoka Jiro communication issues. Koji Koda communication issues. Rikido Sato over-reliance on quirk. Mina Ishido overconfidence, lack of critical thinking skills. Denki Kaminari over-reliance on quirk, lack of critical thinking skills, lack of situational awareness. Tako Uraraka too trusting. Minority Mineta a disturbing amount of warnings for SXL harassment. Todoroki Shudo lack of emotional empathy, refusal to use abilities to fullest extent, self-crippling. Bakugo Katsuki anger, attitude, self-worth, battle rage problems. Izuku Midoriya? He wasn't sure what was up with the quirkless kid. But every instinct in his gut screamed that in spite of the good performance done by the kid in the exam, he had been good with the blades. Almost as good as some heroes Shoyuda knew, but there was definitely room for improvement there. He couldn't help but think there was a lot buried there. Reading the files of his new students only made his apprehension grow even more. Izuku Midoriya was a conundrum in every sense of the word. And evidently he had gone to the same schools as Bakugo Katsuki since they were toddlers. Where Izuku's file was bursting with bad notes disruptive, he bothers the other students, cheats off the other kids in class. Bakugo's file was bursting with praise. And based on the simple battle rage he'd seen overcome the kid during the test, agreeable and helpful were the opposite of what he was. Aizawa groaned he really had his work cut out for him this year, huh?